Some men in history represent evil because they ordered atrocities from behind a desk. Reinhard Heydrich represents evil because he designed the blueprint for them. His mind was not shaped by ideology alone, but by calculation, cold, methodical, efficient. Where others hesitated, he accelerated. Where others hid their cruelty under speeches, Heydrich expressed his through systems. His power did not grow from the battlefield, but from paper, signatures, telegrams, and conferences. And yet, those signatures and telegrams determined who lived and who died. In a regime of fanatics, he was the most dangerous, because he was not a fanatic, he was efficient. Reinhard Heydrich did not begin as a monster. He began as a talented young man with a violin and ambition. Born into a musical family, disciplined by strict parents, he grew up in a world of notes, scales, and precision. That precision followed him into adulthood, long after he abandoned concert halls for naval uniforms. He joined the German Navy, not for ideology, but for prestige. But one scandal, a personal scandal involving a woman, cost him his career. He was dismissed in disgrace, stripped of rank, stripped of purpose. Humiliation created a hunger in him. He looked not for redemption, he looked for power. That search led him to Heinrich Himmler. One meeting changed everything. Himmler offered him a job, not a military command, not a field assignment, but something far more shadowed and dangerous. Build an intelligence service for the SS. Heydrich accepted. In that moment, the architect of silence began building his empire. Files, surveillance, interrogations, blackmail, fear. Every detail fed into a vast security network where Heydrich decided who was useful and who was undesirable. His memory was terrifying. He could recall faces, names, addresses, connections. He turned information into a weapon sharper than any blade. When Hitler seized power, Heydrich moved with ruthless speed. He helped orchestrate purges against political opponents. He used lies to destroy reputations, used secret police to destroy resistance, used deportation lists to destroy lives. While others shouted hatred, Heydrich organized it. He created mechanisms, systems that ran whether he was present or not. He understood something chilling, that genocide does not need emotion. It only needs administration. As Europe fell under Nazi control, Heydrich's influence spread like a toxin. He became the head of the Reich Security Main Office, combining intelligence, secret police, and security into one machine. And then came the moment when history forever attached his name to horror. In January of 1942, in a quiet villa outside Berlin near a frozen lake, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference. Around the table sat lawyers, administrators, SS officers, men in suits, drinking cognac, discussing transportation schedules, train capacity, and quotas. No shouting, no rage, just logistics. On that table lay the foundations of the final solution. Heydrich directed it with chilling calm. He did not weep over ideology. He did not rant about racial hatred. He reduced genocide to numbers, to capacity, to efficiency. He smiled while discussing it. People later said he seemed proud of the clarity of his plan. But the universe has a way of answering cruelty. In 1942, Heydrich travelled to Prague, a city he ruled with violence and execution. He believed he was untouchable. He believed resistance could not touch him. He rode through the streets in an open car with no escort, wearing no bulletproof vest. Arrogance was his armour. Czech resistance fighters backed by British support struck him at a curve in the road. A grenade detonated. Heydrich was wounded. Infection set in. For the first time in his life, efficiency failed him. He died days later, not in glory, not in power, but in pain. His death triggered horror. Villages were burned in. Retaliation. Civilians were executed. Families destroyed. Even in death, Heydrich caused suffering. History does not offer redemption for him. There is no tragic complexity, no misunderstood genius. Reinhard Heydrich was not a man who fell into darkness. He walked into it willingly. He engineered it. He optimized it. And when we study him, we are reminded that the worst crimes are not committed by monsters, but by ordinary humans who choose to abandon morality in favor of power and efficiency. Tonight, we return to the conference rooms where lives were converted into numbers, to the secret files that turned citizens into targets, to the moment where one man reduced humanity into paperwork. This is the entire history of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, the mind of cold efficiency, and proof that evil does not always scream, sometimes it plans. Before we go deeper, I want to ask something simple. Where are you right now as you listen? Are you lying? Under blankets? Letting the night settle around you? Or sitting somewhere quiet with the world outside, dark and still? And what time is it where you are? Late, early, or somewhere in between? I like imagining this story travelling into different corners of the world, connecting one quiet moment to another. And if these slower, deeper journeys into history help you unwind or reflect, consider subscribing. It lets me know that someone out there values thoughtful storytelling, and it keeps me inspired to continue making these long, quiet explorations of the past. March 1904, in the ornate halls of the Halle Municipal Theatre, the sound of a violin echoes through empty corridors. A boy, barely 8 years old, draws his bow across the strings with surprising precision. His father, Bruno Heydrich, rehearses singers on stage for the evening's opera, while young Reinhard practices in the wings, absorbing everything. The music is beautiful. The family's finances are not. Bruno Heydrich had built something remarkable in this provincial German city. The Halle Conservatory, founded in 1901, bore his name and represented his life's ambition. He composed operas with Wagnerian aspirations, conducted with passion, and taught with dedication. But success in the arts rarely translated to stability in early 20th century Germany. The Heydrich family lived well enough, comfortably middle class, but always with the anxiety that comes from depending on culture in a society increasingly valuing industry and military might. And beneath this respectable facade, a whisper followed them through Halle streets, a rumour that would shape young Reinhard's psychology more than any other factor in his childhood. The rumour was simple and devastating. Bruno Heydrich had Jewish ancestry. It wasn't true. Years later, exhaustive Nazi racial investigations would prove the family thoroughly Aryan by their own grotesque standards. But in the virulent anti-Semitism of early 20th century Germany, truth mattered less than accusation. Young Reinhard heard the taunts at the Halle Gymnasium. Classmates called him Isidore, Moses, and worse. They would shout these names in the schoolyard, mocking his high-pitched voice, his artistic sensibilities, his intense focus on music rather than the rough, masculine pursuits his peers valued. He responded not with tears but with fury, learning to fence with obsessive dedication, becoming one of Germany's finest young swordsmen. Every thrust of the blade was an answer to an insult he could never fully escape. 1918 shattered what remained of the Heydrich family's comfortable world. Reinhard was 14 when Germany collapsed into revolution. The Kaiser fled. Soldiers tore epaulets from their officers' shoulders in the streets. Communist revolutionaries and Freikorps paramilitaries fought pitched battles in German cities. Young Heydrich, despite his musical training and refined upbringing, joined a Freikorps youth militia with a wooden rifle. He marched with men twice his age who spoke of betrayal, of Jews and communists stabbing Germany in the back, of the need for ruthless action to restore order. The violence he witnessed in those chaotic months planted something dark in his adolescent mind. Order mattered. Strength mattered. Sentiment was weakness. The 1920s brought hyperinflation and humiliation. Bruno Heydrich's opera house struggled as Germany's currency became worthless. A ticket to a performance cost millions of marks. Workers received wages in wheelbarrows. The middle-class families like the Heydrichs, who had saved money and played by society's rules, watched their savings evaporate overnight. Reinhard threw himself into achievement as his family's world crumbled. He excelled academically, graduating at the top of his class. He won fencing championships. He spoke fluent English and French, and in 1922, at age 18, he made the choice that seemed to promise stability and respect. He joined the Reichsmarine, Germany's rebuilt navy. The navy should have been Reinhard Heydrich's salvation. He excelled at Merwick Naval Academy, impressing instructors with his intelligence and discipline. He qualified as a signals officer, mastering communications technology. His fencing skills brought glory to his unit, and his marksmanship scores approached 95%, exceptional even by naval standards. He received commissions, promotions, and respect. By 1930, at age 26, he had achieved the rank of lieutenant and seemed destined for a successful military career. Then, in a moment of romantic recklessness that would redirect the course of history, he destroyed everything. Her name was Lena von Osten. Heydrich met her at a sailing club ball in December 1930, became engaged within weeks, and then made a catastrophic discovery. He was already informally engaged to another woman, the daughter of an Aspasso's influential shipyard director. Naval honor codes took such commitments seriously. When the first woman's father complained to naval authorities, Heydrich faced a court of honor. On April 30th, 1931, that court delivered its verdict: dismissal from service for conduct unbecoming an officer. Case number 2/4/31 would haunt Heydrich for the rest of his life. In a single session, the institution he had devoted 7 years to serving cast him out with disgrace. May 1931 found Reinhard Heydrich unemployed, humiliated, and desperate in the depths of Germany's depression. 6 million Germans had no work. His naval career was finished. His family had no money to support him. He lived in a cramped pension in Hamburg, a 27-year-old failure without prospects in a country where millions of educated men competed for any available position. It was Lena who saw the opportunity. A fervent Nazi supporter, she had read Heinrich Himmler's advertisement in a nationalist newspaper. The SS required an intelligence officer to establish a security service. Lena pushed her fiancé to apply. Heydrich, with nothing to lose, travelled to Munich. June 14th, 1931. Heydrich sat across from Heinrich Himmler in a small apartment that served as SS headquarters. Himmler, the former chicken farmer leading Hitler's elite guard, needed someone to build an intelligence service from nothing. He gave Heydrich 20 minutes to outline his plan. Heydrich, drawing on his naval communications training, described a comprehensive intelligence network with card files, informants, and systematic information gathering. He spoke with precision and confidence, masking his desperation. Himmler hired him on the spot with a starting salary of 180 marks per month. The violinist's son had found his calling, and the Nazi Party had acquired the man who would make their darkest fantasies operational. The transformation was remarkable and terrifying. Within weeks, Heydrich established the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, operating from a 2-room apartment with borrowed furniture and a handful of assistants. He applied the organizational skills he'd learned in the Navy to building files on Nazi enemies: communists, socialists, liberals, Jews, anyone who might threaten party power. His card index system was methodical and comprehensive. Each person received a file with detailed information, cross-referenced and constantly updated. By the end of 1931, Heydrich had transformed himself from a disgraced naval officer into something far more dangerous: an architect of surveillance, a builder of systems, a man who understood that information, properly organized and ruthlessly applied, was the ultimate weapon. The violin he had played as a boy gathered dust. He had found a darker music to conduct. August 1931. In a converted apartment on Türkenstrasse in Munich, Reinhard Heydrich sat at a borrowed desk surrounded by index cards. 4 assistants worked at typewriters, transcribing information from newspapers, party reports, and informant networks. The entire operation of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence service of Hitler's SS, occupied 2 rooms and operated on a monthly budget that wouldn't purchase a decent automobile. Within 12 years, this improvised spy ring would become the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus Europe had ever seen. The transformation began with a simple principle Heydrich had learned in the Navy: information is power, but only if it's organized. Heydrich's card file system was elegant in its paranoid thoroughness. Every suspected enemy of the Nazi Party received a card with their name, address, occupation, political affiliations, family connections, and any potentially damaging information. Cross-references linked individuals to organizations to each other, creating a web of connections that revealed hidden networks. Communist cells, social democratic party structures, trade union leadership, Jewish community organizations, Catholic Church hierarchy, all mapped with bureaucratic precision. By the end of 1932, Heydrich's files contained information on over 30,000 individuals. The system required neither sophisticated technology nor large budgets. It required only meticulous record-keeping and a network of informants willing to report on their neighbours, colleagues and friends. The system's value became instantly apparent on January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within hours, Nazi stormtroopers and SS units began arresting political opponents across the country. They didn't search blindly. They followed lists prepared by Heydrich's SD, targeting specific individuals with specific addresses. Communist Party leaders found themselves arrested in coordinated sweeps. Trade union organisers disappeared into newly established detention camps. Social democratic politicians fled or surrendered. Journalists who had criticised the Nazis were silenced. The speed and efficiency shocked even seasoned political observers. Germany's opposition infrastructure collapsed in weeks. Not because the Nazis had overwhelming force, but because they had overwhelming information. Heinrich Himmler understood what he possessed in Heydrich. On March 9th, 1933, Himmler became police president of Munich, and he immediately installed Heydrich as his chief of staff. Together, they transformed Bavaria's political police into an instrument of terror that operated beyond traditional legal constraints. Heydrich established interrogation protocols that employed what they euphemistically called enhanced methods, beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological torture. He personally supervised sessions in the basement of police headquarters, watching as detainees broke under systematic pressure. He took notes on which techniques proved most effective. His reports to Himmler read like scientific papers discussing human suffering in terms of efficiency metrics and optimal results. The Bavarian model proved so successful that Hitler and Himmler expanded it across Germany. State by state, Himmler seized control of political police forces, and state by state, Heydrich restructured them according to his template. Prussia's Gestapo, the secret state police, fell under SS control in April 1933. Within a year, Heydrich controlled political police operations in every German state. The SD, his intelligence service, operated parallel to the Gestapo, but with a broader mandate, not just suppressing current opposition, but identifying potential future threats. The division of labour was elegant. The SD gathered information. The Gestapo acted on it. Together, they created a surveillance state of unprecedented scope. Heydrich's organisational genius lay in his understanding that effective terror requires bureaucratic infrastructure. He divided the SD into three main departments: SD Inland for domestic intelligence, SD Ausland for foreign intelligence, and a special section for monitoring Nazi Party members themselves. No one was beyond surveillance. He recruited thousands of informants from every sector of German society. University students reported on professors, workers reported on foremen, apartment building janitors reported on tenants. The system incentivized denunciation with promises of advancement or threats of investigation. By 1937, the SD employed 3,000 full-time agents and could draw on a network of over 50,000 regular informants. The card file system had metastasized into a surveillance apparatus that penetrated every corner of German life. The budget told the story of Heydrich's rising power. From 20,000 Reichsmarks in 1932, SD funding increased to 40 million. Reichsmarks by 1937, a 2,000-fold increase in 5 years. The money purchased equipment, salaries, and infrastructure, but more importantly, it purchased loyalty. Heydrich paid his agents well by German standards and promoted ruthlessly based on results. The most efficient operators advanced quickly. Those who showed squeamishness disappeared from the organisation. Within a few years, he had assembled a corps of men who shared his combination of intelligence and moral emptiness, bureaucrats who could discuss mass arrests over coffee with the same detachment they might discuss railway scheduling. June 1934 brought Heydrich's first major operational test, the Night of the Long Knives. Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA stormtroopers, commanded 3 million men and harboured ambitions to merge his brown shirts with the regular army. Hitler, pressured by Wehrmacht generals and wary of Rome's independence, decided to eliminate him. Heydrich provided the operational plan. His intelligence files identified key SA leaders. His staff prepared arrest lists and execution schedules. His agents coordinated timing across Germany. When Hitler gave the order on June 30th, Heydrich's machine functioned with lethal precision. SA leadership died in coordinated strikes across 16 cities. The official death toll was 77. Heydrich's private records documented over 400 executions. The operation established the SD's reputation for ruthless efficiency and proved that Heydrich could orchestrate complex operations across a nation. The success brought expansion of mission. By 1936, Heydrich had consolidated control over all German police forces under a new umbrella organization, the Security Police, or SIPO, which combined the Gestapo and criminal police under his command. The SD remained separate, nominally a party intelligence service, but Heydrich controlled both. He had become, at age 32, the most powerful police official in Germany, subordinate only to Himmler and answerable only to Hitler. His files now contain dossiers on 1.5 million Germans, more comprehensive than any intelligence service in the world, including the Soviet NKVD. His agents had penetrated every organization in Germany, from labor unions to church groups to the Wehrmacht itself. What made Heydrich particularly dangerous was not sadism, but systematic thinking. He approached human rights violations the way an engineer approaches technical problems, seeking optimal solutions with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. When Jewish emigration became official policy, he established bureaucratic processes to extract maximum wealth from emigrants before expulsion. When political opponents required elimination, he developed legal frameworks that provided cover for murder. When intelligence gathering needed expansion, he created incentive structures that turned neighbours into informants. He was building something unprecedented, a security state where surveillance was total, resistance was impossible, and violence was administrative. The violinist's son had become a conductor of terror, and his orchestra was just beginning to rehearse its most terrible symphony. June 28, 1934. In the basement of SD headquarters on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich worked through the night with his senior staff. Before them lay lists of names, addresses, and precise instructions. The operation bore the codename Colibri Hummingbird, chosen for its implied speed and precision. For weeks, Heydrich's agents had been gathering intelligence on Ernst Röhm and the SA leadership, documenting their activities, mapping their locations, preparing for a coordinated strike across Germany. Hitler had finally given the authorization. The stormtroopers who had brawled their way to power would now be purged by the very movement they had helped create. The SA, Sturmabteilung, was a problem Hitler could no longer ignore. 3 million brown shirts, commanded by the ambitious Ernst Röhm, represented both a threat and an embarrassment. Röhm spoke openly about a second revolution, about merging his SA with the Wehrmacht to create a people's army under his command. Wehrmacht generals despised the undisciplined stormtroopers and made clear to Hitler that they would never accept subordination to Röhm. President Hindenburg, still clinging to influence in the regime's early years, supported the generals. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich saw opportunity. Eliminate the SA leadership, and the SS would become Germany's dominant paramilitary force. All they needed was Hitler's paranoia. Heydrich provided the paranoia's raw material. His SD fabricated documents suggesting Röhm was planning a coup with French support. Intelligence reports, manufactured in SD offices, claimed the SA was stockpiling weapons for an imminent putsch. Transcripts of intercepted communications, some genuine but most doctored, portrayed Röhm as disloyal and dangerous. Heydrich presented this fabricated dossier to Hitler at Berchtesgaden on June 24th, adding carefully selected truths to his lies. Röhm was genuinely contemptuous of Hitler's compromises with conservative elites. Röhm did want to subordinate the Wehrmacht. Röhm's SA had grown dangerously independent. These facts, wrapped in manufactured treason, convinced Hitler that immediate action was necessary. June 30th, 2 o'clock in the morning, Hitler's convoy rolled up to the Hotel Hanselbauer in Bad Wiessee, a resort town where Röhm and SA leadership had gathered for a conference. SS units surrounded the hotel. Hitler personally led the arrest party that burst into Rome's bedroom where the SA chief lay sleeping. The scene was deliberately humiliating. Rome, groggy and confused, was dragged from bed and placed under arrest. In adjacent rooms, other SA leaders were similarly seized. Some were found with male companions, providing propaganda ammunition for later justifications. Within an hour, the top SA leadership was in custody, transported to Munich's Stadelheim prison without trial, without charges, without any pretense of due process. But Bad Visi was just the beginning. Across Germany, Heydrich's operation unfolded with mechanical precision. In Berlin, Goering directed SS execution squads from the Lichterfeld barracks. SA leaders were brought in small groups to a courtyard wall. Each group was shot before the next arrived, an assembly line of murder that processed targets with bureaucratic efficiency. In Munich, Heydrich personally supervised operations from police headquarters, receiving telephone reports every hour and issuing new orders. His lists extended beyond SA leadership. Political enemies from years past found themselves swept up in the purge. General Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor, was shot in his home along with his wife, Edgar. Jung, a conservative critic who drafted recent speeches criticizing the regime, was murdered. Catholic leaders, monarchists, personal enemies of Hitler and his lieutenants all disappeared into the coordinated massacre. The killing continued through July 1st. Heydrich's coordination system proved its worth. 21 separate SS and SD units operated across 16 German cities, each following precise instructions, each reporting back to Central Command. There was no confusion, no conflicting orders, no operational chaos. The targets were identified by Heydrich's card file system. The timing was synchronized by SD communications networks. The execution was carried out by carefully selected personnel who understood that success would be rewarded and failure punished. It was, in a grotesque sense, a triumph of organization over chaos, of systematic planning over improvised violence. Ernst Röhm himself survived the initial arrests. Hitler, remembering their long association from the earliest days of the Nazi movement, hesitated to order his old comrade's execution. For 36 hours, Röhm sat in his cell at Stadelheim prison while Hitler wavered. Himmler and Heydrich did not waver. They needed Röhm dead to complete the SA's decapitation. On July 1st, Theodor Eicke, commandant of Dachau concentration camp, arrived at Röhm's cell with Michael Lippert. They offered Röhm a pistol to commit suicide, giving him 10 minutes to use it. Röhm refused. "If Adolf wants to kill me," he reportedly said, "let him do it himself." Eicke and Lippert shot him at close range. The SA's leader died in a pool of blood on a prison floor, murdered by the regime he had helped create. On July 13th, Hitler addressed the Reichstag to justify the purge. He claimed to have acted against an imminent coup, portraying himself as Germany's saviour from treasonous plotters. The official death toll, announced by Hitler, was 77. The actual number was at least 400, possibly more. Heydrich kept meticulous private records documenting every execution, but these files remained classified. Foreign observers were shocked by the brazen murder of political opponents without trial. But within Germany, many citizens accepted Hitler's narrative. The SA had been visibly undisciplined and threatening. Order had been restored, and, beneath the surface, Heydrich had established a crucial precedent. The security apparatus could kill German citizens en masse without legal process. And not only would there be no punishment, there would be no investigation. The Night of the Long Knives transformed the SS from Hitler's personal guard into Germany's dominant terror organisation. The SA survived, but as a neutered auxiliary, its membership declining to less than 1 million and its political influence destroyed. Heydrich's SD and Himmler's SS expanded to fill the vacuum, absorbing resources, personnel, and authority. More importantly, Heydrich had demonstrated his ability to coordinate complex operations across a nation, to maintain secrecy despite involving hundreds of operatives, and to execute violence with bureaucratic precision. These capabilities would be refined over the next years and eventually applied to operations far more terrible than the murder of a few hundred political opponents. The purge also revealed Heydrich's operational philosophy. Violence served the state, not personal passion. Every execution advanced a strategic objective: eliminating SA independence, securing SS dominance, removing Hitler's political enemies, demonstrating the regime's willingness to act ruthlessly. Heydrich's lists included SA leaders, but also non-SA targets whose deaths served other purposes. The operation's scope expanded opportunistically to settle old scores and remove inconvenient witnesses. This combination of strategic planning and tactical opportunism would characterize all of Heydrich's later operations. He was not a sadist killing for pleasure. He was a technocrat, eliminating obstacles to power. That made him far more dangerous. September 15th, 1935, inside the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, the Reichstag assembled for a special session during the Nuremberg Party rally. The delegates, surrounded by banners and ceremony, prepared to vote on two laws that would fundamentally alter Jewish existence in Germany. The legal language was precise, almost clinical. Citizenship would be redefined by blood, marriage would be regulated by race, sexual relations between Germans and Jews would become criminal offences. Watching from the gallery, Reinhard Heydrich knew these laws represented the formalisation of something his SD had been implementing informally for 2 years: the systematic exclusion of Jews from German society through administrative action. The Nuremberg laws emerged from months of bureaucratic preparation involving multiple government ministries, but the SD's influence pervaded the process. Heydrich's staff had compiled comprehensive statistics on Germany's Jewish population, approximately 500,000 individuals in a nation of 65 million. They mapped Jewish residence patterns, economic activities, organisational structures, and community leadership. This data informed the law's provisions. The definition of who counted as Jewish required mathematical precision. 3 or more Jewish grandparents made someone a full Jew. 2 Jewish grandparents created a Mischling, a person of mixed race, subject to different regulations. The laws transformed personal identity into calculable percentages, turning family history into a bureaucratic problem requiring administrative solutions. Heydrich understood that legal persecution required institutional infrastructure. The Nuremberg laws provided the framework, but implementation required coordination across German society. Jewish students needed expulsion from schools, requiring cooperation from education ministries. Jewish professionals needed removal from their occupations, requiring cooperation from licensing boards. Jewish businesses needed identification and boycott, requiring cooperation from economic ministries and local governments. The SD became the coordinating body, sending directives and following up to ensure compliance. What emerged was something unprecedented: administrative anti-Semitism, where persecution happened not through violent pogroms, but through bureaucratic procedure. The system's efficiency improved with practice. By 1936, Jews faced exclusion from dozens of professions. They could not teach in universities or schools. They could not practice law. They could not work in journalism. They could not serve in the military. They could not marry non-Jews or have sexual relations with them. Each restriction required bureaucratic enforcement: forms to file, registries to check, violations to investigate. The SD monitored compliance, creating a surveillance network, specifically targeting Jewish communities. Informants reported on Jews who violated regulations. Investigators pursued allegations with bureaucratic thoroughness. The result was a society where daily anti-Semitism became routine administration. March 1938 brought the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria, and with it 190,000 additional Jews under Nazi jurisdiction. Heydrich travelled to Vienna within days of German troops entering the city. He established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in the confiscated Palais Rothschild, the former residence of the banking family. The office's director was Adolf Eichmann, a mid-level SD officer whom Heydrich had identified as particularly effective in Jewish affairs. Eichmann's mission was simple: force Austrian Jews to emigrate as quickly as possible by making their continued residence intolerable while extracting maximum wealth from them before departure. The central office operated like an assembly line. Jews entered at one end with their citizenship, property, and rights. They exited at the other end with exit visas, stripped of assets and legal status. The process required navigating multiple bureaucracies: tax offices, property registries, police headquarters, passport authorities. Under previous systems, this navigation could take months. Eichmann centralized everything in one location. Jews passed from desk to desk, each extracting its required payment or document, until they emerged at the end with permission to leave and nothing else. The system processed 150,000 Austrian Jewish emigration cases in 18 months, an efficiency that impressed Heydrich immensely. Here was proof that large-scale population movement could be achieved through bureaucratic innovation. August 17, 1938. A seemingly minor regulation required all Jewish men to add Israel and all Jewish women to add Sarah to their legal names. The purpose was purely administrative, simplify identification in official records. But the regulation revealed the regime's direction. Jews were being marked in preparation for something larger. Passports received special stamps. Identity cards received special designations. Public records received special notations. Every system that interacted with Jewish citizens implemented modifications to track and identify them. Heydrich's bureaucrats justified each change with practical arguments about administrative efficiency, but together they formed a comprehensive tracking system. November 9th, 1938. A 17-year-old Jewish refugee named Herschel Grinspan shot Ernst von Rath, the German diplomat in Paris, protesting his family's deportation to Poland. Von Rath died 2 days later. The assassination provided Heydrich and Goebbels with the pretext they needed for an operation they had been planning for months, a nationwide pogrom disguised as spontaneous popular outrage. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, was actually a carefully coordinated operation directed from Berlin. Heydrich sent detailed teletype instructions to police and SD officers across Germany, specifying acceptable and unacceptable actions. Synagogues could be burned, but not adjacent buildings. Jewish businesses could be vandalized, but not plundered. Jews could be beaten, but not yet killed in large numbers. The pogrom unfolded across Germany on November 9th and 10th, with mechanical coordination that belied claims of spontaneity. 267 synagogues were destroyed. 7,500 Jewish businesses were vandalized. 91 Jews were murdered in the initial violence, though hundreds more died from injuries in following weeks. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Heydrich monitored the operation from SD headquarters, receiving hourly reports and issuing corrections when local operatives exceeded their instructions. The violence was calibrated, designed to terrorize without descending into complete chaos. After Kristallnacht, the regime fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks as atonement for von Rath's murder. Heydrich had discovered that persecution could be revenue-generating. The pogrom's aftermath demonstrated Heydrich's administrative approach reaching full maturity. On November 12th, at a meeting chaired by Hermann Goering, Heydrich presented a comprehensive plan for accelerating Jewish emigration from Germany. He requested authority to establish a Reich Central Office for Jewish emigration based on his successful Viennese model. Goering, impressed by the statistics from Vienna, granted the authority on January 24, 1939. Within months, Heydrich had scaled his assembly line expulsion system to all German-controlled territories. By September 1939, 282,000 Jews had emigrated from Germany proper, and another 117,000 from Austria. These numbers represented success by the regime's standards. Jews were leaving, their assets remained behind. And the administrative machinery for processing mass population movements had been tested and refined. Soon, Heydrich would redirect that machinery toward far darker purposes. August 22nd, 1939. At the SD headquarters building on Prince Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich stood before a gathering of SS officers in a secure conference room. These men commanded the Einsatzgruppen, special task forces that would follow the Wehrmacht into Poland. The invasion was scheduled to begin in 9 days. Heydrich's briefing covered logistics, communication protocols, and operational parameters. But when he described their special tasks, he used language deliberately vague. They would secure territories behind the front lines. They would arrest dangerous elements. They would take necessary measures to ensure German security. Every officer in the room understood. The euphemisms concealed orders to kill Polish leadership on a massive scale. This would be war of a different kind. Poland was home to 3.5 million Jews. 10% of the population and the largest Jewish community in Europe. It was also home to an educated Polish elite, Catholic clergy with enormous influence, and nobility with centuries of tradition. Hitler and Heydrich agreed that Poland would not merely be conquered but decapitated. The invasion's military phase would destroy Poland's army. The Einsatzgruppen's security phase would destroy Poland's capacity to resist. The targets were specific: government officials, military officers, clergy, teachers, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, landowners, and Jewish community leaders. Anyone capable of organizing resistance. Anyone who represented Polish culture and identity. The operation had a name: Intelligenzaktion. Action against the intelligentsia. September 1st. 1939. German forces crossed into Poland at dawn. Behind the advancing armies came 6 Einsatzgruppen: EGI, EG2, EG3, EGIV, EGV, and EGVI, totaling 3,000 men drawn from SD, Gestapo, and criminal police personnel. Each Einsatzgruppe was subdivided into smaller Einsatzkommandos that could operate independently across assigned territories. These were not combat units. They were mobile killing squads equipped with trucks, communication equipment, weapons, and lists. Heydrich's central office had prepared files on thousands of Poles designated for elimination, compiled from intelligence gathered over preceding years. The lists went to Einsatzgruppen commanders, who distributed them to subordinate units. The killing began within hours of invasion. September 3rd, 1939, in the city of Bydgoszcz, known to Germans as Bromberg, violence erupted as Polish civilians and ethnic Germans fought in the streets during the German advance. The incident became known as Bloody Sunday, with accounts disputed but deaths numbering in the hundreds. Einsatzgruppe 4 arrived within days and used the incident as justification for massive reprisal. They executed over 1,000 Polish civilians, both Jews and Catholics, claiming all were responsible for the earlier violence. The massacre established a pattern. Any Polish resistance, real or fabricated, would trigger overwhelming retaliation. Heydrich's forces were not bound by military law or proportionality. They were instruments of terror, deliberately escalating violence to break Polish morale. The Wehrmacht initially protested. German army officers, trained in conventional warfare with codes of conduct, were shocked by the Einsatzgruppen's methods. General Johannes Blaskowitz submitted written complaints about SS atrocities to Wehrmacht command. Other officers documented killings of civilians and protested to their superiors. The conflict between military and SS reached Hitler, who sided decisively with Heydrich and Himmler. The Führer ordered the Wehrmacht to focus on military operations and leave security matters to the SS. This decision established crucial precedent. The SS would operate independently of military oversight, answerable only to Hitler through Himmler and Heydrich. The protests ceased, the killings continued. September 21st, 1939. With Poland's military defeat assured, Heydrich issued a classified directive known as the Schnellbrief, the express letter to all Einsatzgruppen commanders. The document outlined the next phase. Polish Jews would be concentrated in urban ghettos, particularly in cities with good railway connections. This concentration would be temporary, pending a final goal that remained unspecified. The directive revealed Heydrich's thinking. Mass murder had begun, but no comprehensive plan yet existed for millions of Polish Jews. The ghetto system would serve as a holding solution, keeping Jews confined and controlled while Heydrich developed more permanent measures. It was improvisation within systematic brutality, tactical adjustment while maintaining strategic direction toward increasingly radical solutions. November 6, 1939. In Krakow, 183 professors from Jagiellonian University, one of Europe's oldest academic institutions, assembled in response to a German invitation to discuss academic affairs. The meeting was a trap organized by Heydrich's men. SS troops arrested the entire faculty and deported them to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The action exemplified Heydrich's strategy: destroy the educated class first. Without teachers, Poland would have no educated next generation. Without intellectuals, resistance would lack leadership. The Krakow arrests were replicated across occupied Poland. By December 1939, over 6,000 teachers, 3,000 physicians, several hundred priests, and hundreds of lawyers, and judges had been murdered or imprisoned. Poland's educated class was being systematically eliminated. The killing scale shocked even hardened observers. Estimates for the first 4 months of occupation range from 50,000 to 60,000 Polish deaths at German hands, the vast majority civilians murdered by Einsatzgruppen and security police. The victims included approximately 7,000 Jews killed during the initial invasion, but the majority were Catholic Poles targeted for their social position or potential resistance. Heydrich tracked the numbers through regular reports to his Berlin headquarters. Each Einsatzgruppe submitted daily tallies. Central officers compiled statistics. The bureaucracy of murder was functioning efficiently, documenting its own crimes with meticulous precision. January 1940 saw the establishment of the first major ghetto in Łódź, Poland's second largest city. Heydrich's orders were clear: concentrate the city's 164,000 Jews into a sealed district in the city's poorest quarter. Non-Jewish residents would be evacuated. Jews from surrounding areas would be moved in. The ghetto would be enclosed with barbed wire and wooden fences. Exit would be prohibited without special permits. Internal administration would fall to a Jewish council that would enforce German regulations among the imprisoned population. The Łódź ghetto became operational in April 1940, serving as laboratory for the comprehensive ghetto system that Heydrich would implement across occupied Poland. Poland had taught Heydrich crucial lessons. Mobile killing units worked. The Wehrmacht could be neutralized as an obstacle to SS operations. Massive crimes could be committed without facing international intervention. Systematic murder of educated classes could proceed with bureaucratic efficiency, and when operations reached scales beyond bullets and rope, alternative methods would need development. That development would occur in Poland too, with gas fans tested in Chełmno in 1941. But first, Heydrich had another opportunity: expansion westward into France and Low Countries in 1940, and then most significantly, eastward into the Soviet Union in 1941. Each campaign would refine the machinery of murder. Each would push further toward the comprehensive genocide that was emerging, not from a master plan, but from the systematic radicalization of men who had discovered that mass murder was administratively feasible. September 27th, 1941. A black Mercedes pulled up to the gates of Hradčany Castle in Prague, the ancient seat of Bohemian kings overlooking the city from its hilltop position. From the car emerged SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, appointed just 2 days earlier as acting Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He wore his SS uniform with its array of decorations, the German cross in gold, the War Merit, cross medals from his earlier military service. At 37 years old, he was taking control of 7 million Czechs in territories Germany had absorbed after dismembering Czechoslovakia. His predecessor, Konstantin von Neurath, had been deemed too lenient. Resistance had increased. Production had suffered. Hitler wanted the situation resolved with characteristic ruthlessness. He had chosen his most efficient problem solver. Heydrich wasted no time establishing his administration's character. Within hours of arriving, he declared martial law across the protectorate. By nightfall, arrest lists were circulating to Gestapo offices across Bohemia and Moravia. The lists bore the hallmarks of Heydrich's earlier work: meticulously prepared, carefully prioritized, targeting resistance organizers, Communist Party members, intellectual leaders, and anyone who had demonstrated anti-German sentiment. The Czech government in exile, broadcasting from London, had called for resistance. Heydrich's response was to eliminate anyone capable of organising it. The terror began immediately and without warning. October 1st, 1941. At the Kobylisy shooting range on Prague's outskirts, 92 Czechs faced SS firing squads in the first mass execution of Heydrich's protectorate. The condemned included resistance members, but also hostages arrested for their associations rather than specific acts. Their bodies were displayed publicly, photographed for newspapers, used as warning. Over the following weeks, the executions continued with industrial regularity. German newspapers published death notices listing the executed by name and alleged offence. The message was clear: opposition meant death, and association with opposition meant death. Within 3 months, over 400 Czechs were executed and 5,000 more imprisoned. The resistance networks that had been growing under Neurath's administration were shattered, but Heydrich did not rely solely on terror. He understood that effective occupation required both stick and carrot, punishment and incentive. In November 1941, he implemented a series of social reforms that stunned observers. Czech workers received increased food rations, improved social insurance benefits, and enhanced workplace protections. Unemployment, which had affected 40,000 Czechs, dropped to 18,000 within months through expanded industrial production. Heydrich personally toured factories, speaking to workers about their conditions and promising improvements. He presented himself as stern but fair, demanding loyalty but rewarding compliance. It was social engineering on a national scale. The economic motivation was simple. The Protectorate's industrial capacity, particularly the Škoda works in Plzeň, was vital to Germany's war effort. Škoda produced artillery, tanks, small arms, and munitions. The factories employed tens of thousands of Czech workers whose productivity had declined under Neurath's administration due to resistance activity and poor morale. Heydrich's strategy aimed to break resistance through terror while improving production through material incentives. Workers who collaborated would eat better and work in safer conditions. Workers who resisted would die. The combination proved devastatingly effective. By March 1942, Škoda Works production had increased 20% over previous year's levels. Heydrich also exploited Czech society's divisions. His administration distinguished between ethnic Czechs and ethnic Germans living in the Protectorate, favouring the latter with resources and opportunities. He differentiated between rural and urban populations, directing benefits toward industrial workers while maintaining harsh control over countryside. He even distinguished between racially valuable and racially worthless Czechs, promising that individuals who demonstrated German sympathy might eventually be considered for Germanization. This division sowed distrust and broke solidarity. Czechs informed on each other for personal advantage. Communities fractured along lines of collaboration and resistance. Heydrich's intelligence services exploited these fractures ruthlessly. December 1941. At the Chernin Palace, serving as Heydrich's official residence and office, he hosted a reception for Czech industrialists and businessmen. The evening featured food, wine, and reassurance. Heydrich promised continued prosperity for those who cooperated with German war production. He spoke of a post-war Europe where Czechs who proved loyal would have respected positions. He was charming, cultured, speaking fluent Czech along with German. Many attendees left convinced that accommodation with Germany offered the best path forward. Some would maintain this belief until liberation. Others would be executed for collaboration. Heydrich cared nothing for their ultimate fates. He needed their cooperation for 2 or 3 years, no more. The acting Reich Protector commuted daily between his residence at the Lower Castle and government offices in central Prague, travelling in an open Mercedes without heavy security. His driver and 1 guard accompanied him, but the car remained unarmoured and the route predictable. When subordinates suggested additional protection, Heydrich refused. He believed the harsh reprisals he had instituted would deter assassination attempts. Any attack on him would trigger massive retaliation, and the Czech resistance knew it. Besides, Heydrich had supreme confidence in his intelligence services. The SD and Gestapo had penetrated resistance networks thoroughly. He knew resistance capabilities were broken, or so he believed. But Heydrich did not know everything. In London, the Czechoslovak government in exile and British Special Operations Executive were planning Operation Anthropoid. Czech and Slovak paratroopers were training specifically for Heydrich's assassination, learning his routes and habits from intelligence reports. The operation was desperately risky, guaranteed to trigger savage reprisals, potentially damaging Czech morale more than helping it. But the government in exile needed to demonstrate that collaboration came with consequences, that Czech resistance still existed, and that Nazi leaders were not invulnerable. As Heydrich drove his regular route each morning, confident in his security and proud of his achievements as Reich Protector, men with British weapons and Czech determination prepared to prove him fatally wrong. What Heydrich had achieved in Bohemia and Moravia was remarkable from the Nazi perspective. He had broken organised resistance, increased industrial production vital to the war effort, and established a model of occupation that combined terror with material incentives. Hitler praised him as the ideal proconsul, the administrator who understood how to control subject populations. Other occupied territories looked to the Protectorate as a template. If Heydrich could be replicated across the conquered East, German rule might be sustainable for generations. But sustainability required the Protector's continued presence. And in the spring of 1942, that presence was about to be violently terminated, with consequences that would demonstrate both the strength and limitations of the administrative terror Heydrich embodied. June 1940. Paris had fallen. Wehrmacht troops marched through the Arc de Triomphe. The French government fled to Vichy. Germany controlled Western Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. In Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich's staff pulled old files from storage and began revising a plan that had seemed fantastical just months earlier: mass deportation of European Jews to Madagascar. The tropical island off Africa's east coast was a French colony, and France was now defeated. Germany could dictate terms. For a brief moment, the Nazi leadership seriously considered shipping millions of Jews across oceans to establish what amounted to a vast prison island under SS administration. The plan's seriousness revealed how the regime approached the Jewish question as an engineering problem, awaiting technical solutions. Madagascar was not a new idea. The concept of Jewish resettlement there had appeared in European anti-Semitic literature since the 1880s. Poland had investigated Madagascar as a potential destination for Jewish emigration in 1937, dispatching a commission that returned with negative conclusions about the island's capacity. The Nazis themselves had explored the idea before the war, but France's defeat transformed fantasy into apparent feasibility. Franz Rademacher, the Foreign Office's newly appointed Jewish expert, produced a detailed memorandum in June 1940 proposing Madagascar as a solution. The island would become a super ghetto administered by the SS, with Heydrich as its police governor. The numbers involved were staggering. Nazi planners calculated that 4 million Jews would need transportation from territories under German control. This figure assumed Germany would conquer Britain and the Soviet Union, bringing millions more Jews under Nazi jurisdiction. The logistics seemed manageable if one treated humans as cargo. Franz Rademacher calculated that if each ship carried 4,500 people and voyages took 6 weeks round trip and Germany controlled sufficient shipping, the entire deportation could occur over 4 years. 900 transports, 15,000 people monthly. The calculations filled memoranda circulated between Heydrich's RSHA, the Foreign Office, and Goering's Economic Planning Office. August 15th, 1940. Heydrich presented the Madagascar plan formally to Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. His proposal went beyond mere deportation. Madagascar would become a Jewish reservation under SS police governance. The island's 4 million existing inhabitants would be displaced or subordinated. European Jews would be stripped of citizenship before deportation and would never receive Malagasy citizenship. They would exist in permanent statelessness under German guard. The SS would maintain a police force of approximately 25,000 men to ensure control. It was colonialism merged with concentration camp administration, an entire society engineered for subjugation. Heydrich's subordinate Adolf Eichmann threw himself into detailed planning with characteristic bureaucratic enthusiasm. Eichmann's office calculated shipping requirements, port capacities, and transitional holding facilities. They estimated costs, projected timelines, and identified obstacles. The greatest obstacles proved insurmountable. First, Madagascar's climate and infrastructure could not support millions of additional residents without massive investment Germany could not afford during wartime. Second, and more critically, the plan required control of sea lanes to transport Jews from Europe to Africa. As long as the Royal Navy dominated the Atlantic and Mediterranean, no mass deportation was feasible. The Madagascar plan assumed British defeat. By September 1940, Britain remained undefeated. The plan's advocates never seriously addressed these obstacles because Madagascar was always more rhetorical than real. For Heydrich, it served multiple purposes. It provided cover for the regime's anti-Jewish policies, suggesting the goal was removal rather than extermination. It allowed bureaucrats to discuss the Jewish question in terms that sounded administrative rather than murderous, and it offered a transitional framework while more radical solutions developed. Heydrich knew by late 1940 that German victory over Britain was unlikely in the near term. He knew the logistics of transporting 4 million people across war zones and oceans were prohibitive, but planning the impossible served his purposes while he developed the practical. March 1941 brought the definitive end to Madagascar fantasies. Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union scheduled for June. Conquering Soviet territories would bring millions more Jews under German control, making Madagascar's capacity even more inadequate. Simultaneously, the invasion would concentrate German resources on continental warfare, making transoceanic deportation impossible. Heydrich quietly directed his staff to suspend Madagascar planning and prepare for alternative solutions. The language changed subtly. Instead of emigration or deportation, internal documents began referencing the coming solution in the East. What solution in the East meant remained deliberately vague through spring 1941. Heydrich's planning sessions with Eichmann and other SD Jewish affairs specialists explored various scenarios. One possibility was deportation beyond the Urals after Soviet defeat, removing Jews to Siberian territories where they would presumably die from harsh conditions. Another was concentration in massive labour camps, where Jews would be worked to death in infrastructure projects. A third, discussed only obliquely in spring 1941, but becoming more explicit by summer, was systematic killing on a scale that dwarfed the Einsatzgruppen operations in Poland. The momentum pushed toward increasingly radical measures. The Madagascar plan's most revealing aspect was not its content, but its casualness. Nazi bureaucrats discussed shipping millions of people to their deaths, because that's what Madagascar would have meant, in memoranda discussing tonnage and transit times. They debated Jewish mortality rates from tropical disease, with the detachment of actuaries calculating insurance risks. Heydrich chaired meetings where educated men with law degrees and doctoral dissertations allocated shipping for human cargo, with no more moral reflection than if planning grain exports. The bureaucratic treatment of genocide created psychological distance that enabled participation. Madagascar revealed the mechanism before the mechanism was fully operational. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Madagascar had been forgotten by everyone except historians looking for evidence of the regime's trajectory toward genocide. Heydrich had already moved on, coordinating with Himmler and Hitler on the Einsatzgruppen's expanded mission in Soviet territories. The Madagascar files went into storage, occasionally referenced in propaganda but never seriously revisited. The territorial solution had failed before being attempted. What followed was not territorial but terminal, not deportation but destruction. And Heydrich, having explored every alternative his methodical mind could conceive, committed fully to the solution that his entire career had been preparing him to implement: the systematic murder of every Jew in Europe. The machinery of deportation became machinery of death. The bureaucracy of emigration became bureaucracy of extermination. And the administrator who had tried Madagascar's illusion would soon convene a conference to coordinate genocide's reality. June 17th, 1941. At a training camp in Prech, a small town on the Elbe River south of Berlin, 3,000 men assembled for final briefings before the largest military operation in history. These were not regular soldiers. They wore SS and police uniforms, and they had been selected from security police, Gestapo, and SD for special assignments in the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Reinhard Heydrich stood before the assembled officers in a commandeered school building and explained their mission with characteristic euphemism. They would secure territories behind advancing Wehrmacht lines. They would eliminate Bolshevik commissars and officials. They would address the Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia. Everyone in the room understood. The invasion would be two wars simultaneously: the Wehrmacht's military campaign and the SS's racial war. The Einsatzgruppen organised for Barbarossa dwarfed their Polish predecessors in scale and ambition. 4 main groups, designated A, B, C, and D, would follow army groups North, Centre, and South into Soviet territory. Each Einsatzgruppe commanded 700 to 1,000 men, subdivided into smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos that could operate independently across vast distances. Einsatzgruppe A would sweep through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Einsatzgruppe B would follow the central thrust toward Moscow. Einsatzgruppe C would operate in Ukraine. Einsatzgruppe D would secure the southern territories and Crimea. Together, they would follow the Wehrmacht across a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Heydrich's instructions, delivered both orally and in written directives, established initial targeting priorities. The primary victims would be Communist Party officials, political commissars attached to Red Army units, Soviet intelligence agents, partisan fighters, and the Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia. This last category was deliberately broad. In Nazi racial ideology, Jews and Bolshevism were inseparable, two manifestations of the same existential threat to Germany. Every Jew in Soviet territory was assumed to be either a Bolshevik or a potential partisan. The targeting would begin with military-aged Jewish men, but would soon expand based on doctrines of collective guilt and racial war. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa commenced at 3:15 in the morning, with the largest invasion force ever assembled, over 3 million German and Axis troops striking across the Soviet frontier. The Einsatzgruppen crossed immediately behind the first wave, sometimes entering towns within hours of Wehrmacht units. Their initial operations focused on Soviet officials and visible Jewish community leaders. In Kaunas, Lithuania, Einsatzgruppe A organised local collaborators to conduct a pogrom that killed over 1,000 Jews in the invasion's first days. In Lutsk, Ukraine, Einsatzkommando 4 shot 1,160 Jewish men on June 27th. The killing patterns established in Poland were re-implemented in Soviet territories, but with crucial differences: larger scale, faster pace, and from the beginning, an explicit focus on Jewish populations. The coordination between Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen was complex and often contentious. The German military provided the Einsatzgruppen with logistical support, fuel, rations, and communication facilities. Army units cordoned areas where massacres occurred, preventing victims from fleeing and witnesses from interfering. Some Wehrmacht officers and soldiers participated directly in killings or handed Jewish prisoners to Einsatzgruppen for execution, but other officers protested, filing complaints about atrocities occurring in their operational areas. These protests reached high command and created the same crisis that had occurred in Poland. Hitler resolved it identically. Military and SS operations would remain separate, with SS answering only to Himmler and Heydrich. July 1941 brought an ominous escalation. Himmler visited Einsatzgruppen units behind the lines and delivered new instructions: expand targeting to include Jewish women and children. The rationale invoked military necessity. Jewish children would grow into adults who would seek revenge for their parents' deaths. Jewish women might bear future partisans. Entire communities needed elimination to ensure German security. This genocidal logic spread through Einsatzgruppen ranks during summer 1941. By August, the killings had shifted from selective murder of military-aged men to comprehensive community annihilation. Every Jew in captured territories, regardless of age or gender, became a target. August 27 and 28, 1941. Near the Ukrainian city of Kamianets-Podilsky, Einsatzgruppe C and German police battalions murdered 23,600 Jews in 2 days. The victims included Jews who had fled from Hungary into Soviet territory, where Hungarian authorities had expelled them. German forces marched the victims in columns to bomb craters and ravines outside the city, shot them in groups, and threw bodies into mass graves. The Kamianets-Podilsky massacre represented a logistical breakthrough, proving that 5-figure killings could be accomplished in 48 hours through coordination between Einsatzgruppen and auxiliary police units. Heydrich received detailed reports and immediately recognized the operational implications. September 29 and 30, 1941. Outside Kiev, at a ravine called Babi Yar, Einsatzgruppe C conducted the largest single massacre yet attempted. Over 2 days, 33,771 Jews were murdered. The operation required meticulous planning. German authorities posted notices ordering Kiev's Jews to assemble for resettlement, creating the fiction that they were being deported rather than killed. Victims gathered by the thousands, bringing possessions they believed they would need in transit. They were marched in groups to Babi Yar, forced to undress, and shot in the ravine. The killing continued for 2 days without pause, processing thousands per hour through an assembly line of murder. the psychological toll on shooters became an operational concern. Einsatzgruppen commanders reported increasing rates of alcoholism, psychological breakdowns, and declining shooting efficiency among their men. Killing thousands daily with rifles and machine guns proved traumatic even for men selected for their ideological commitment and lack of empathy. Heydrich and Himmler began exploring alternative methods that would reduce psychological burden on perpetrators. Gas vans, trucks with engines modified to pump carbon monoxide into sealed cargo compartments were tested in occupied Poland in late 1941. The vans could kill 30 to 50 people per trip, less efficient than shooting but requiring fewer personnel directly involved in killing. By December 1941, the Einsatzgruppen submitted reports documenting approximately 500,000 murders in 6 months. Heydrich received these reports in Berlin, compiled them into comprehensive summaries, and forwarded them to Himmler and other Nazi leadership. The documents were classified Secret Reich matter, but they circulated widely enough that dozens of officials knew the broad outlines of what was occurring in the East. The killings happened in broad daylight, witnessed by Wehrmacht soldiers, local populations, and even German civilian administrators. This was not a hidden conspiracy. It was systematic, documented, and coordinated from the highest levels of the Nazi state. The Einsatzgruppen operations in the Soviet Union proved that mass murder on an unprecedented scale was operationally feasible. Hundreds of thousands could be killed with relatively small killing units, provided those units had military support, willing local collaborators, and victims who were concentrated, disarmed, and disoriented by invasion chaos. But the operations also revealed limitations. Shooting was inefficient, psychologically damaging to perpetrators, and logistically complex when operating across vast distances. If the Jewish question was to receive a comprehensive solution, something more systematic was required. Heydrich had the experiences from Poland and the Soviet Union. He had the bureaucratic apparatus to coordinate across occupied Europe. He had Hitler's authorization to pursue increasingly radical measures. By late 1941, as Einsatzgruppen continued their mobile killing operations, Heydrich began planning something more comprehensive, more efficient, and more terrible than anything yet attempted. He began planning the conference that would coordinate genocide across a continent. October 16, 1940. Warsaw's Jewish population woke to find German soldiers and Polish police sealing their neighbourhoods behind walls and barbed wire. Over the preceding weeks, 113,000 Polish Gentiles had been evacuated from an area in the city's centre and north. In their place, 138,000 Jews from other districts were forcibly relocated. Combined with Jews already living in the designated area, 380,000 people were now imprisoned in 1.3 square miles. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of over 1,000 such prisons the Germans would establish across Eastern Europe, was now operational. Reinhard Heydrich's September 1939 directive to concentrate Jews in urban ghettos had metastasized into a comprehensive system of containment, exploitation, and death. The ghetto system served multiple purposes in Nazi planning. Initially, ghettos were temporary holding solutions, concentrating Jewish populations, while Heydrich and other Nazi leaders determined a final policy. Concentration simplified administration and surveillance. Thousands of Jews scattered across towns and villages required extensive resources to monitor and control. Hundreds of thousands concentrated in sealed urban districts required only perimeter guards and restricted entry. Ghettos also served economic functions. Imprisoned populations could be exploited for labour without payment. Their property could be confiscated without resistance, and if mortality rates proved high, as they did, the deaths could be blamed on overcrowding and disease rather than deliberate policy. Warsaw illustrated the system's lethal mathematics. 380,000 people confined to 1.3 square miles created a population density of approximately 292,000 per square mile, roughly 7 times Manhattan's density. The Germans allocated official food rations of 184 calories per person per day, compared to 669 calories for Poles and 2,613 calories for Germans. These allocations ensured starvation. Only massive smuggling operations, organised by Jews risking death to slip through gaps in the walls, kept daily caloric intake around 1,100 calories. Even with smuggling, malnutrition was universal. Disease followed inevitably. Heydrich had ordered the establishment of Jewish councils, Judenräte, to administer ghetto internal affairs. This policy forced Jewish community leaders into impossible positions. The councils were required to implement German orders, allocating housing, distributing inadequate food rations, providing forced labor quotas, maintaining order, and eventually selecting deportees for transport to death camps. Council members who refused orders were shot and replaced. Council members who complied became instruments of German policy while trying to minimize harm to their communities. The system was deliberately designed to compromise Jewish leadership and shift responsibility for suffering onto Jewish administrators rather than German authorities. February 1941. At an RSHA meeting in Berlin, Heydrich reviewed monthly mortality statistics from ghettos across occupied Poland. Warsaw showed approximately 2,000 deaths per month from starvation and disease, about 20% annual mortality rate. Łódź reported similar figures. Heydrich commented that these rates were insufficient given the need to reduce Jewish populations. His administrators discussed methods to accelerate death without overt killing, further reducing rations, eliminating medical supplies, preventing heating fuel delivery during winter months. Starvation and disease were killing methods that could be implemented through bureaucratic decisions about resource allocation. No shootings required, no gas chambers yet needed, just administrative choices to withhold necessities. April 1941. In the Łódź ghetto, German authorities established an extensive forced labour system. Over 80,000 Jews worked in textile factories, metalworks, and other production facilities, serving German military and civilian needs. Workers received slightly better rations than non-workers, creating incentives to work despite appalling conditions. The Germans extracted enormous value from this system. Ghetto factories produced goods worth millions of Reichsmarks while operating costs were minimal. No wages paid to workers, facilities confiscated from previous owners, and raw materials obtained through plunder. Heydrich recognized that ghettos could be revenue generating before their populations were eliminated, extracting maximum economic value from victims before their murder. July 1941. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, Heydrich ordered ghetto establishment in every conquered Soviet city with significant Jewish populations. Minsk, Riga, Vilnius, Kaunas, Lvov each received orders to concentrate Jewish residents in sealed districts. The Soviet ghettos were established with less elaborate infrastructure than Polish predecessors. Many consisted of simple barbed wire enclosures around existing Jewish neighborhoods. Security was looser, but mortality was higher. Soviet ghettos served less as long-term holding facilities and more as assembly points for subsequent massacres by Einsatzgruppen. Jews would be concentrated, held for weeks or months, then marched to nearby forests or ravines for execution. The total ghetto system eventually encompassed over 1,100 separate ghettos, imprisoning approximately 3.5 million Jews across Eastern Europe. The largest, Warsaw and Łódź, held hundreds of thousands each. Medium ghettos imprisoned tens of thousands. Small-town ghettos might contain only hundreds. All operated on similar principles: concentration, isolation, exploitation, and deliberately induced mortality pending final liquidation. The system was coordinated from Heydrich's Berlin headquarters, with regional administrators implementing policies adapted to local conditions. It represented bureaucratic genocide's infrastructure, the temporary phase between expulsion and extermination. December 10th, 1941. Near the Polish village of Chełmno, approximately 35 miles from Łódź, the first pure extermination facility became operational. The Chełmno camp used gas vans to murder Jews transported from the Łódź ghetto. This marked the beginning of the end for the ghetto system. What had been holding facilities would now become transit points for deportation to death camps. The temporary solution was transitioning to the final solution. Heydrich had spent 2 years developing and refining the ghetto system, learning how to concentrate, control, and exploit millions. Now he would liquidate what he had created. The ghetto system's legacy was over 500,000 deaths before the death camps became operational. Starvation killed hundreds of thousands. Typhus epidemics, spread by overcrowding and absence of sanitation, killed tens of thousands more. Exposure during harsh winters killed thousands. Random shootings and executions killed thousands. These deaths were not accidental consequences of wartime hardship. They were deliberate results of calculated German policies on rations, medical care, sanitation, and housing. Heydrich and his administrators discussed mortality rates in meetings and adjusted policies to increase deaths. The ghettos were death traps before they became transit points to death camps. And every death, every statistic, was documented in reports flowing to Heydrich's desk in Berlin, where the architect of administrative genocide prepared for his next innovation. Coordinating extermination across an entire continent, January 20th, 1942. At number 56 to 58, Am Großen Wannsee, a pleasant villa overlooking a lake in suburban Berlin. 15 men gathered for a meeting that would last 90 minutes and coordinate the murder of 11 million people. The villa had been confiscated from a Jewish owner and converted to a guest house for SS personnel. The meeting room featured high ceilings, elegant furnishings, and large windows providing lake views. Waiters served coffee and cognac. The attendees were state secretaries and senior officials representing every major government ministry. Interior, Justice, Foreign Office, Reich Chancellery, 4-year plan, Nazi Party Chancellery, plus multiple SS and police agencies. Their average education level included doctoral degrees and legal training. They were administrators, not thugs, and the man who had summoned them, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, was about to demonstrate how genocide could be discussed in language of bureaucratic planning. Heydrich had originally scheduled the conference for December 9th, 1941, but postponed it following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Germany's declaration of war on the United States. By January, the strategic situation was clarified, though not favourably for Germany. The Wehrmacht had stalled outside Moscow. The Soviet Union had not collapsed as predicted. America's entry meant prolonged global war. But for Heydrich's purposes, these military concerns were secondary. The Einsatzgruppen had already murdered over 500,000 Soviet Jews. Chelmno extermination camp was operational. The decision to murder all European Jews had already been made at the highest levels. Wannsee's purpose was not to authorize genocide, but to coordinate it, ensuring bureaucratic cooperation across agencies whose participation was essential for continent-wide implementation. At noon, the attendees took their seats around a large table. Heydrich opened by reminding participants that Hermann Goering had authorized him in July 1941 to prepare a comprehensive solution to the Jewish question across German-influenced Europe. He then presented the conference's central statistic: 11 million Jews. Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's specialist on Jewish affairs, had prepared detailed tables breaking down Jewish populations by country. The numbers included not only territories under German control, but also neutral and enemy nations. 330,000, Ireland 4,000, Spain 6,000, 18,000, even Sweden, a neutral country far from German reach, 8,000. The table revealed the scope of Nazi ambition. This was not a plan for Jews in occupied Poland or the Soviet Union. This was a plan for every Jew in Europe. Heydrich proceeded to outline the methodology with clinical detachment. Emigration, previously pursued as policy, was now forbidden due to wartime restrictions. Instead, Jews would be evacuated to the east for labour deployment. The able-bodied would be separated by sex and employed in road construction and other heavy labour under conditions that would naturally reduce their numbers. Those who survived this attrition would require special treatment, as they would constitute the fittest and most potentially dangerous. Special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, was a euphemism that everyone in the room understood meant murder. Heydrich did not need to explain. These were educated men who read reports and understood coded language. The discussion turned technical. What to do with Mischling, people of mixed Jewish and German ancestry? The meeting devoted substantial time to this question, debating whether first-degree Mischlinge should be deported or forcibly sterilised. Would German Jews over 65 be deported or concentrated in special ghettos like Theresienstadt? How would foreign Jews in German territory be handled? What about Jews married to non-Jewish Germans? The deliberations involved legal definitions, bureaucratic procedures, and practical logistics. No one questioned the fundamental policy. The only questions were implementation details: how to identify targets, how to transport them, how to coordinate across jurisdictions, how to handle edge cases in racial law. Representatives from the Justice Ministry raised questions about legal frameworks. State Secretary Joseph Buhler, representing occupied Poland, volunteered that the general government's 2.5 million Jews should be handled first, as they represented disease and black market threats. Wilhelm Stuckart from the Interior Ministry proposed comprehensive sterilization of Mischlinge as preferable to deportation. Martin Luther from the Foreign Office discussed coordination with Germany's allies: Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia. Each nation with Jewish populations required diplomatic handling to secure cooperation for deportations. The conversation flowed like any government planning meeting. Bureaucrats coordinating complex operations across multiple agencies, resolving jurisdictional conflicts, establishing procedures. Heydrich dominated the meeting absolutely. He had called it, he had set the agenda, he had prepared the materials, he controlled the discussion. Attendees were not asked for opinions on whether the policy should proceed. They were informed that it would proceed and told how their agencies would contribute. The Interior Ministry would handle citizenship issues. The Justice Ministry would provide legal frameworks. The Foreign Office would coordinate with allied states. The 4-year Plan Office would handle economic impacts. The Transportation Ministry, not represented at Wannsee but already coordinating with Eichmann, would provide trains. Every agency had a role. Every official was implicated. What Wannsee demonstrated was the banality of administrative evil. 15 educated men spent 90 minutes discussing the murder of millions in language of resource allocation and logistical coordination. They drank cognac. They reviewed statistical tables. They debated legal definitions. And when the meeting concluded at 1:30 in the afternoon, they had established bureaucratic consensus for the most comprehensive genocide in human history. Eichmann prepared a 30-page protocol summarizing the meeting. Heydrich reviewed it and ordered revisions to obscure the most explicit language. The final protocol, 15 pages, was distributed to attendees with a classification of secret Reich matter. 30 copies were made. Only copy 16 survived the war, discovered in German Foreign Office files in 1947. Wannsee's importance lay not in initiating the Holocaust, which had already begun, but in systematizing it. After Wannsee, every German government ministry understood its role in genocide. Transportation provided trains. Finance confiscated assets. Foreign Office coordinated international aspects. Interior Ministry handled citizenship revocations. Local governments organised roundups and deportations. The bureaucracy of genocide operated with files, forms, regulations, and procedures. Jews were stripped of citizenship, registered, concentrated, deported, and murdered through processes that looked superficially like normal administration. The horror was precisely that it was routine, coordinated through memoranda and meetings, implemented by officials who went home to families after planning mass murder. For Heydrich, Wannsee was a triumph. He had secured cooperation from every necessary bureaucracy. He had established himself as the coordinator of the final solution, reporting directly to Himmler and Hitler, but controlling operational details. And he had demonstrated the ultimate application of his bureaucratic genius, creating a system where genocide could be implemented by thousands of participants who would follow procedures, fill out forms, and obey orders, each contributing small pieces to industrial murder while maintaining psychological distance from the ultimate horror. Heydrich left Wannsee knowing he had coordinated the greatest crime in human history. Within months, he would be dead. But his machinery would continue operating, executing the plan he had presented on that cold January day by the lake, March 17th, 1942. In the Lublin district of occupied Poland, near the village of Belzec, the first transport from Lublin Ghetto arrived at a newly constructed facility. 600 Jews disembarked from freight cars. Confused by German reassurances about resettlement and showers, they were herded into a building camouflaged to resemble a bathhouse, the doors sealed. Diesel engines started pumping carbon monoxide into the chambers. Within 20 minutes, all 600 were dead. Their bodies were dragged to mass graves by Jewish forced labourers who would themselves be murdered within weeks. Belzec was operational, the first of 6 purpose-built death factories that Reinhard Heydrich's organisational work had made possible. This was industrialised murder, killing optimized through architecture, engineering, and bureaucratic process. Belzec was part of Operation Reinhard, named either for Heydrich himself or for a cover name used in planning documents. The operation aimed to murder all Jews in the general government, occupied Poland's central region containing approximately 2.5 million Jews in ghettos established per Heydrich's earlier directives. SS Brigadeführer Odilo Globoknik, SS and police leader for Lublin district, received operational command from Heydrich. Globoknik was efficient, brutal, and thoroughly corrupt, embezzling vast sums from confiscated Jewish property. Heydrich tolerated the corruption as long as the killing proceeded on schedule. And it did, with mechanical efficiency that shocked even hardened observers. 2 more Operation Reinhard camps followed Belzec's template. Sobibor opened in May 1942 in a remote forest area. Treblinka opened in July 1942 near a railway junction serving Warsaw. All 3 operated identically. Victims arrived by train, told they were at transit camps en route to labour deployment. They surrendered valuables and undressed for showers. They were herded through camouflaged pathways, called tubes, to gas chambers disguised as bathhouses. Carbon monoxide from diesel engines or captured Soviet tank engines killed them. Jewish forced labour units, Sonderkommandos, extracted corpses, sorted valuables, and buried or burned bodies. The Sonderkommandos were periodically murdered and replaced to eliminate witnesses. The Operation Reinhard camps were pure death factories, with minimal infrastructure. Unlike concentration camps with barracks, workshops, and administrative facilities, these camps existed solely for murder. Belzec occupied approximately 0.2 square miles. The staff consisted of 20 to 30 SS personnel and 80 to 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries recruited from Soviet POW camps. The killing capacity was enormous relative to staff size. Belzec murdered approximately 434,500 people with a staff of 150. Sobibor killed approximately 170,000. Treblinka killed 800,000 to 900,000, making it the 2nd deadliest site of the Holocaust after Auschwitz. Auschwitz represented a different model, a concentration camp complex that added extermination facilities to existing infrastructure. The Auschwitz main camp had opened in June 1940 as a prison for Polish political prisoners. Auschwitz II Birkenau opened in October 1941, became the primary killing centre. By June 1942, when Heydrich received final reports on its expansion before his death, Auschwitz was transitioning to Zyklon B gas, hydrogen cyanide, absorbed into pellets that released poison when exposed to air. Zyklon B killed faster than carbon monoxide, increasing efficiency from 45 minutes to approximately 20 minutes per gassing. Heydrich approved plans for 4 large crematorium buildings at Birkenau, each combining underground gas chambers with cremation ovens. Crematoria 2 and 3 could each gas and cremate 2,500 people daily. Crematoria IV and V could handle 1,500 each. Combined capacity, 6,400 murders per day, nearly 2 million per year, if operating continuously. The engineering was sophisticated. Gas chambers were disguised as collective showers. Ventilation systems removed poison gas after killing. Elevators lifted corpses to cremation ovens. Chimneys dispersed smoke and ash. And all of it was documented in architectural plans, construction contracts, and equipment orders that treated industrial murder as engineering problem-solving. The camp locations were strategically selected. All sat near railway lines, enabling mass deportations. All were in occupied Poland, removed from German public view. Operation Reinhard camps were in particularly remote areas, minimizing witnesses. Auschwitz was near the town of Oświęcim in Upper Silesia, an industrialized area where a large SS presence seemed unremarkable. The remoteness and secrecy were deliberate. Heydrich understood that while the genocide had tacit support from Nazi leadership and many ordinary Germans, its mechanics needed concealment. Explicit knowledge created resistance. Administrative distance enabled participation. The death camp system also included Chelmno, operational since December 1941, and later Majdanek near Lublin. Each camp served specific regions. Chelmno handled Jews from the Łódź ghetto and surrounding areas. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka liquidated general government ghettos. Auschwitz received Jews from across Europe: France, Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Hungary, Norway, and elsewhere. The coordination required to transport millions across a continent at war demonstrated the bureaucratic apparatus's scope. Adolf Eichmann's office in the RSHA coordinated with transportation ministries across occupied Europe, scheduling trains, allocating cars, and ensuring uninterrupted flow of victims to killing centres. May 1942 brought Heydrich's final inspection tour of occupied Polish territories. He reviewed reports on Operation Reinhardt's progress. Belzec was operational. Sobibor was nearing completion. Treblinka was under construction. The ghettos would be systematically liquidated starting summer 1942. Warsaw's 380,000 Jews would be deported to Treblinka. Łódź's 160,000 would go to Chelmno and later Auschwitz. Smaller ghettos across Poland would be emptied. Heydrich approved the schedules and returned to Prague to resume his duties as acting Reich protector. He would never see his system's full implementation. Within weeks, he would be dead. July 22nd, 1942, the Warsaw ghetto deportations began, though Heydrich had died in June. SS and police units surrounded blocks, forced residents into assembly points, and loaded them onto trains, 5,000 daily, then 6,000, eventually 7,000 per day. By September, 300,000 Warsaw Jews had been transported to Treblinka and murdered. The operation proceeded with the efficiency Heydrich had engineered. His death changed nothing operationally because he had built systems that functioned independently of personal direction. The machinery of genocide continued operating, processing human beings through bureaucratic stages, from identification to deportation to murder, all documented with forms and figures and clinical language that disguised unfathomable evil as administrative necessity. Heydrich had died, but his machine worked on. March 1942. At Cholmondeley, a country estate in southern England, converted to a special operations executive training facility, 2 Czechoslovak soldiers prepared for a mission both recognised as likely suicidal. Josef Gabčík, 29, was Slovak, a skilled soldier who had escaped to France after Czechoslovakia's dismemberment and then to Britain after France's fall. Jan Kubiš, 28, was Czech, following a similar path of exile and commitment to resistance. For months, they had trained specifically for Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. The training included parachuting, close combat, weapons handling, and detailed study of Heydrich's habits, routes, and security measures. British intelligence and the Czechoslovak government in exile knew the operation would trigger massive German reprisals. They considered it necessary anyway. The strategic justification for Anthropoid was complex. The Czechoslovak government in exile, based in London under President Edvard Beneš, desperately needed to demonstrate that Czech resistance remained active. The Munich Agreement of 1938 had forced Czechoslovakia's surrender without fighting, creating the perception of Czech passivity. After Germany's occupation, resistance had been minimal and ineffective. Britain questioned whether to recognise Czechoslovakia's pre-war borders in post-war planning. Killing Heydrich, the highest-ranking Nazi outside Germany proper, would prove Czech willingness to fight. It would also demonstrate to occupied populations across Europe that Nazi leaders were vulnerable, that resistance was possible, that collaboration came with consequences. The plan was operationally straightforward but tactically challenging. Gabčík and Kubiš, along with 7 other Czechoslovak agents, parachuted into the Protectorate in December 1941. They made contact with underground resistance cells in Prague. Through patient surveillance, they confirmed Heydrich's routine. Every morning, Heydrich commuted from his residence at the Lower Castle in Prague to his office at Hradčany Castle or to meetings in the city centre. He travelled in an open Mercedes convertible with his chauffeur and 1 SS guard. The car was unarmoured. Heydrich refused additional security, believing his harsh reprisals had eliminated resistance capability. His arrogance created vulnerability. The assassination team identified an ideal location: a hairpin turn in the Holešovice neighbourhood where Heydrich's car would necessarily slow to approximately 15 miles per hour. The street featured a sharp curve with limited visibility, allowing attackers to position themselves on both the inside and outside of the turn. The plan involved two men. Gabčík would attempt to shoot Heydrich with a Sten submachine gun as the car approached. If the gun failed, Kubiš would throw a modified anti-tank grenade as the car passed. Other team members would provide lookout and escape support. The attack was scheduled for late May 1942, timed to coincide with Heydrich's regular commute. May 27th, 1942, 10:30 in the morning. Gabčík and Kubiš took positions at the Holešovice curve. A third agent, Josef Valčík, positioned himself up the street with a mirror to signal Heydrich's approach. At 10:32, Valčík flashed the signal. Heydrich's green Mercedes convertible came into view. Heydrich sitting in front beside his driver, SS Oberscharführer Klein. As the car slowed for the turn, Gabčík stepped into the street, raised his Sten gun, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. For a critical second, Gabčík stood frozen, holding a useless weapon while Heydrich stood up in the car and reached for his pistol. Klein braked instead of accelerating through the ambush. Kubiš, positioned on the curves outside, threw his grenade, the modified British No. 73 anti-tank grenade, packed with additional shrapnel, exploded against the Mercedes' right rear wheel. The blast shattered the car's frame, sent shrapnel and automobile fragments flying, and wounded Heydrich, Klein, and Kubiš himself. In the explosion's confusion, Gabčík fled on bicycle while Kubiš, injured and disoriented, also escaped. Heydrich, wounded but mobile, got out of the car and pursued Gabčík briefly before collapsing. Klein chased Kubiš but lost him. Czech bystanders summoned help. Heydrich was transported by a passing delivery truck to Bulovka Hospital. At Bulovka, doctors found Heydrich conscious and responsive. Examination revealed shrapnel wounds to his left side. Fragments had penetrated near the spleen, ruptured the diaphragm, and lodged near the spine. Surgery was performed that afternoon. Heydrich's spleen was removed. Fragments were extracted. The wounds were cleaned. Initial prognosis was cautiously optimistic. The injuries seemed survivable with proper treatment. Heinrich Himmler dispatched Germany's top physicians to Prague. Hitler demanded hourly updates on Heydrich's condition. For several days, Heydrich appeared to be recovering. He spoke with visitors. He worked from his hospital bed. His wounds were healing. June 2nd, 1942. Heydrich's condition suddenly deteriorated. He developed septicemia, blood poisoning from bacterial infection. Despite surgery and antibiotics, the infection spread rapidly. Fever spiked. Consciousness faded. The physicians tried everything available: sulfanilamide drugs, experimental treatments, blood transfusions. Nothing worked. The infection was too advanced and antibiotics too primitive. Penicillin, which might have saved him, was not yet available in Europe. British and American researchers had proven its effectiveness, but mass production had not begun. For want of a drug that would become common within 2 years, Heydrich died from infections introduced by grenade fragments, car upholstery materials, and his own uniform fibres driven into his wounds. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 in the morning. Reinhard Heydrich died at age 38 in a Prague hospital bed, surrounded by Himmler's doctors and SS guards. The immediate cause was septicemia from a streptococcus infection. The ultimate cause was 2 Czechoslovak soldiers with a jam gun and a grenade. News of his death spread instantly through Nazi communications networks. Hitler was reportedly enraged, demanding vengeance on a scale that would terrorize occupied populations into total submission. Himmler was devastated, having lost his most capable subordinate and closest collaborator. The Czech resistance was vindicated but terrified, knowing what was coming. And across occupied Europe, people wondered if Heydrich could be killed, were any Nazi leaders safe? Heydrich's body was transported to Berlin for a state funeral of unprecedented grandeur. Hitler personally delivered the eulogy, calling Heydrich the man with the iron heart, and promising that his work would continue. The SD, Gestapo, and security police were reorganised under Ernst Kaltenbrunner, but no replacement could match Heydrich's combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and organisational genius. The machinery Heydrich had built would continue operating through the war's end, implementing the genocide he had coordinated at Wannsee. But the architect himself was gone, killed by two men armed with British weapons, Czech courage, and desperate determination to prove that resistance mattered even at terrible cost. June 10th, 1942. German soldiers surrounded the Czech village of Lidice, approximately 10 miles northwest of Prague. The village had no connection to Heydrich's assassination. Its 173 men and boys over age 15 had not participated in resistance activities. But Gestapo investigations had produced a fabricated report suggesting Lidice residents had harbored assassins. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the village's complete destruction as retaliation for Heydrich's death. What followed was not military action, but annihilation. Every male over 15 shot, every woman deported to concentration camps, every child either murdered or evaluated for potential Germanization. The village itself was razed, erased from maps, designated for permanent obliteration. The Lidice massacre unfolded with bureaucratic organization. All 173 men and boys were assembled in the courtyard of Horak's farm on the village outskirts. They were shot in groups of 10 against a barn wall by security police firing squads. The executions continued from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, processing victims with efficiency that revealed practiced routine. 184 women from Lidice were transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Most would die there. The village's 82 children were sent to Łódź, where SS racial examiners evaluated each child. 6 infants deemed suitable for Germanization were sent to SS families for adoption. The remaining 76 children, including babies, were murdered in gas vans at Chelmno extermination camp. After the killing, German forces systematically destroyed Lidice. Houses were burned and dynamited. The church was demolished. The cemetery was ploughed under, gravestones pulverized. Trees were uprooted. The village pond was filled. German authorities declared the very name Lidice abolished, ordering its removal from all official records and maps. The destruction was filmed for propaganda purposes, creating a record that would later become evidence at war crimes trials. The message was clear. This was the price of killing a Nazi leader. Not just retaliation against perpetrators, but obliteration of entire communities to terrorize all occupied populations into submission. June 18th, 1942. At the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in central Prague, German forces surrounded 120 resistance fighters and sympathizers who had supported Operation Anthropoid. The operation culminated a frenzied 2-week investigation using thousands of Gestapo and SS personnel. The break came when Karel Čerda, a Czech resistance member who had parachuted with a different team, betrayed the assassins for 1 million Reichsmarks reward money. Čerda provided the Gestapo with names, locations, and network details. Within days, the net closed on the church where Gabčík, Kubiš, and 5 other parachutists were hiding in the crypt. The final battle lasted over 2 hours. 3 parachutists in the church's nave fought until killed or forced to suicide. 4 in the crypt, including Gabčík and Kubiš, held off assault teams despite being outnumbered and trapped. German forces flooded the crypt with water from fire hoses, attempting to drown the defenders. They pumped tear gas through ventilation. They blasted through walls with explosives. The 4 men fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then used their last bullets on themselves. Gabčík committed suicide after being wounded. Kubiš had already died from his wounds sustained in the assassination. Their bodies were displayed publicly, photographed for propaganda, then cremated with ashes scattered secretly to prevent martyrdom. June 24th, 1942. A second village, Ležáky, met Lidice's fate. Ležáky was smaller, with only 33 residents, but a resistance radio transmitter had been discovered nearby. German security forces executed all adults, murdered all children, except 2 infants selected for Germanization, burned every building, and erased the village from existence. The destruction was more complete than Lidice, because Ležáky had been smaller and more isolated. Nothing remained. The site became an empty field, 2 villages destroyed. 500 lives ended, thousands more imprisoned or deported, all for the death of 1 man. The reprisals extended far beyond 2 villages. In Prague alone, over 1,357 Czechs were executed in June and July 1942 following Heydrich's death. 3,000 more were arrested and deported to concentration camps, where most died. But the most cynical exploitation of Heydrich's assassination involved Prague's remaining Jewish community. The Germans had already planned the liquidation of Bohemia and Moravia's Jews, but accelerated the timetable, blaming Jews collectively for the assassination despite zero Jewish involvement. Over 3,000 Jews were deported from the Protectorate to concentration and death camps in summer 1942, murdered not for participating in resistance, but for Nazi convenience in linking Heydrich's death to ongoing genocide. The reprisals served multiple purposes beyond revenge. They demonstrated to occupied populations across Europe that Nazi leadership was untouchable, that assassination attempts would trigger overwhelming collective punishment. They tested the limits of terrorizing civilians into absolute submission, and they provided opportunity to settle scores, eliminate suspected resistors, and advance already planned policies under the cover of justified retaliation. Heydrich's death became a tool for escalating terror, as Heydrich himself would likely have exploited it had roles been reversed. September 1942. Berlin Philharmonic Hall hosted Reinhard Heydrich's state memorial service 3 months after his death. The delay allowed organizational grandeur matching Nazi propaganda purposes. Hitler delivered the eulogy personally before an audience, including the Nazi elite. The Berlin Philharmonic performed, playing the music Heydrich had loved as a child when his father conducted opera in Halle. The ceremony merged high culture with violence, art with atrocity, exactly as Heydrich's life had merged those contradictions. The violinist's son, who had built the machinery of genocide while maintaining a passion for classical music, received a funeral celebrating both aspects of his personality. Refined cultured administrator and ruthless architect of murder, Karol Czerda, the traitor who had betrayed the Anthropoid team for money, lived under German protection until war's end. After liberation, the Czechoslovak government tried him for treason. His defense, that he had acted under duress and had been trying to minimize reprisals, convinced no one. The court documented how his betrayal led directly to the deaths of over 250 resistance members and sympathizers. Czerda was executed by hanging in Prague on April 29, 1947. His name became synonymous with treachery in Czech culture. The Germans had paid him 1 million Reichsmarks. He had spent a fraction before fleeing. His ultimate reward was infamy and death. The British and Czechoslovak governments faced difficult questions about Anthropoid's value. They had killed Heydrich, proving resistance possible and securing Czech recognition in post-war planning. But the price was over 5,000 Czech lives in immediate reprisals, plus accelerated persecution of remaining Jews. Some historians argue the operation was militarily and politically justified, demonstrating resistance and eliminating a uniquely capable Nazi leader. Others argue the reprisals outweighed any benefits, that resistance must calculate costs against achievements. Neither calculation addresses the fundamental truth. Heydrich had made himself a legitimate target through his orchestration of genocide. His death was just, even if its consequences were tragic. And the reprisals revealed, once again, that Nazi brutality needed no excuse. It required only opportunity. July 22nd, 1942. Despite Reinhard Heydrich's death 6 weeks earlier, the Warsaw Ghetto deportations began exactly on schedule. SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Höfle coordinated the operation from a desk in Warsaw, implementing plans Heydrich had approved months before. Every day, 5,000 to 7,000 Jews were assembled at the Umschlagplatz, the deportation square, loaded into freight cars, and transported 62 miles northeast to Treblinka death camp. The trains ran with bureaucratic precision. The killing continued without interruption. Heydrich was dead, but his machinery operated exactly as designed. The architect was gone. The architecture remained. The question that consumed Nazi leadership after Heydrich's death was whether anyone could replace him. Heinrich Himmler, devastated by the loss of his most capable subordinate, initially considered leaving Heydrich's positions vacant, managing the security police and SD personally. But Himmler lacked Heydrich's administrative genius and operational focus. He was an ideologue, not a systematic administrator. After several months, Himmler appointed SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a brutal Austrian Nazi who had led SS operations during the Anschluss, to lead the RSHA. Kaltenbrunner was ruthless and loyal but thoroughly conventional. He implemented existing policies rather than innovating new ones. He was an executioner, not an architect. August 1942. Operation Reinhard reached peak efficiency despite Heydrich's absence. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were murdering approximately 15,000 Jews daily combined. The ghettos across occupied Poland were being systematically liquidated according to schedules prepared in Heydrich's lifetime. Łódź Ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto, Krakow Ghetto, Radom Ghetto, Lublin Ghetto all fed deportation trains that ran with the punctuality Heydrich had demanded from German railways. Adolf Eichmann's office in the RSHA, the department Heydrich had created specifically for coordinating Jewish deportations, continued functioning without pause. Eichmann reported to Kaltenbrunner but followed procedures established under Heydrich. The bureaucracy required no genius to operate. It required only compliance. October 1942. Einsatzgruppen operations in the Soviet Union continued murdering Jews in occupied territories. Monthly reports compiled by the RSHA documented thousands of executions across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Einsatzgruppen had killed over 1 million Jews by this point, their operations unaffected by Heydrich's death because they followed established protocols and reported through intact command structures. Local commanders like SS Brigadeführer Friedrich Jekyll in Ukraine and SS Standartenführer Karl Jaeger in Lithuania implemented comprehensive murders without requiring central direction. Heydrich had built systems that operated through routine rather than charisma. January 1943. Auschwitz-Birkenau's 4 new crematorium buildings with underground gas chambers became operational, completing the expansion Heydrich had approved before his death. Crematoria 2 and III, the largest, could each murder and cremate 2,500 people daily. The facilities represented the perfection of industrial killing, architectural design optimized for efficient mass murder, engineering applied to genocide, modernity's tools repurposed for evil. Heydrich had supervised the planning. His death changed nothing about the execution. Rudolf Höss, Auschwitz commandant, continued implementing policies exactly as Heydrich had directed. The camp's capacity matched Wannsee Conference projections. The machinery worked. November 1943. Operation Reinhard concluded with Erntefest, the Harvest Festival, a coordinated massacre of 42,000 Jews in 3 camps across occupied Poland over a single day. The operation targeted Jewish forced labourers who had been kept alive for economic exploitation. Once their labour was no longer required, they were murdered en masse. The coordination required thousands of SS personnel operating simultaneously across hundreds of miles. The communication networks, organisational structures, and command chains that made Erntefest possible were all systems Heydrich had built. His death, 18 months earlier, hadn't degraded the machinery's function. If anything, the machinery had improved through practice. 1944 brought the Holocaust's most intense phase: the deportation and murder of Hungary's 437,000 Jews in 56 days. Adolf Eichmann personally supervised Hungarian operations, coordinating deportation trains, negotiating with Hungarian authorities, and ensuring continuous transport to Auschwitz. The speed was unprecedented. Nearly 8,000 murders daily, sustained for 2 months. Eichmann followed Heydrich's playbook precisely: bureaucratic coordination, transportation logistics, camp capacity utilization, and ruthless efficiency. The Hungarian operation proved the ultimate test of Heydrich's systems. They performed beyond original specifications. The architect had designed well. The total Holocaust death toll reached approximately 6 million Jews by war's end in May 1945. Of those, roughly half were murdered after Heydrich's death in June 1942. The most intense killing occurred in his absence. 1943 and 1944 saw higher murder rates than any period of Heydrich's lifetime. This demonstrated something profound and terrifying about systematic evil. Once genocide was institutionalized, Once bureaucracies were aligned and procedures established, once thousands of participants understood their roles and accepted the system's logic, the process continued, independently of individual leadership. Heydrich had created something that transcended him. Several factors explain the machinery's continued function. First, the basic decision to murder all European Jews had been made at the highest level by Hitler himself, with enthusiastic support from Himmler, Goebbels, and other Nazi leadership. Heydrich had coordinated implementation but hadn't originated the policy. Second, the operational systems Heydrich built were designed for routine administration rather than requiring continuous genius. Deportation schedules, camp operations, documentation procedures all followed established patterns that mid-level bureaucrats could maintain. Third, ideology drove participants independently of leadership. The men running Einsatzgruppen, death camps, and deportation systems believed in Nazi racial doctrine. They needed no further motivation. But perhaps most importantly, genocide had become normalized within Nazi-controlled space. By 1943, thousands of Germans and collaborators across Europe participated in Holocaust operations. They processed paperwork, drove trucks, guarded trains, operated crematoria, sorted possessions, kept records, and filed reports. For them, genocide was their job, performed with the same attention to procedure and career advancement as any bureaucratic employment. Heydrich had created a system where ordinary people committed extraordinary evil through ordinary means, following orders, meeting quotas, advancing careers. The machinery didn't need an architect. It needed only operators willing to push buttons and pull levers. And Europe, in 1943, had thousands willing to serve. January 27th, 1945. Soviet Red Army units of the 1st Ukrainian Front entered the Auschwitz complex in occupied Poland, expecting to find an operational concentration camp. What they discovered exceeded imagination's capacity for horror. 7,000 prisoners remained alive, too sick or weak to join the death marches the Germans had forced on healthier inmates days earlier. The Soviet soldiers found warehouses containing 358,000 men's suits, 836,000 women's coats and dresses, and 7.7 tons of human hair packaged for sale to German textile manufacturers. They found thousands of children's shoes arranged in neat stacks. They found rooms filled with eyeglasses, prosthetic limbs, and suitcases labelled with names and addresses of people who had believed they were being resettled. The evidence of industrial murder overwhelmed the liberators. Auschwitz-Birkenau contained 5 crematoria with 46 ovens and multiple gas chambers. The Soviets found partially destroyed facilities, damaged by German demolition efforts in the final weeks, but still obviously designed for mass killing. They interviewed survivors who described the selection process. New arrivals assessed on the railway platform, those deemed fit for labour sent to barracks, those deemed unfit sent immediately to gas chambers disguised as showers. Most transports lost 70 to 80% of their people within hours of arrival. The survivors the Soviets found were living evidence of genocide's industrial scale. April 11th, 1945, American forces from the 6th Armoured Division liberated Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar in central Germany. Unlike Auschwitz, Buchenwald had been primarily a labour camp rather than an extermination facility, but the death toll from starvation, disease, and execution was still over 56,000. American soldiers found 21,000 survivors, many barely alive. The liberators also discovered the medical experimentation building where SS doctors had conducted experiments on prisoners. Most shocking were the preserved human skin samples, including pieces with tattoos that SS personnel had collected as souvenirs. The depravity was beyond military experience or civilian imagination. April 15th, 1945. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen camp in northern Germany. Bergen-Belsen had begun as a holding camp for Jews the Germans intended to exchange for German prisoners held by Allies. By war's end, it had become a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps further east. Overcrowding, starvation, and disease killed 13,000 in the final weeks before liberation. British soldiers entering the camp found 60,000 living prisoners and approximately 13,000 unburied corpses. Typhus was epidemic. The liberators immediately quarantined the camp, but 9,000 more prisoners died in following weeks despite medical care. The British filmed the liberation, creating documentary evidence that shocked audiences worldwide. May 5, 1945. American forces from the 11th Armored Division reached Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, one of the last major camps to be liberated. Mauthausen was notorious for its stone quarry, where prisoners were worked to death carrying stone blocks up 186 steps, called the Stairs of Death. The camp's official death toll exceeded 95,000, but actual deaths were likely higher. Americans found thousands of survivors, starving and disease-ridden, and extensive documentation of the camp's operations. The Germans had been less thorough in destroying records at Mauthausen than elsewhere, leaving evidence of systematic murder through labour exploitation. Summer 1945 brought systematic investigation of the liberated camps. Allied investigators collected testimony from survivors, documented physical evidence, and searched for German records. The scale of documentation surprised investigators. The Nazis had kept meticulous records of their crimes, transport lists documenting millions of deportees, camp registration books, death certificates, administrative correspondence about rations and gas supplies, and photographs of operations. The Germans had treated genocide as administrative work requiring proper documentation. This bureaucratic thoroughness created evidence that would prove crucial at post-war trials. The discovery of Operation Reinhard camps Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka came later and provided less physical evidence. The Germans had dismantled these pure extermination facilities in 1943 after completing their missions, ploughing the grounds and planting trees to conceal the killing sites. But investigators interviewed the few dozen survivors who had escaped during camp uprisings or been kept alive as witnesses to later murders. These testimonies, combined with captured German documents referencing the camp's operations, established that nearly 2 million people had been murdered at 3 sites operated for barely 18 months. The efficiency was extraordinary and terrible. Survivors provided detailed descriptions of how the systems Heydrich had coordinated actually functioned on the ground. They described selections where SS doctors decided life or death with finger movements. They described gas chambers disguised as showers, some with fake shower heads installed to maintain the deception until the final moment. They described the Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to operate the crematoria who were periodically murdered and replaced to eliminate witnesses. They described the sorting of possessions, the extraction of gold teeth from corpses, the sale of hair and personal effects. Every detail revealed bureaucratized murder. The total death toll emerged slowly from compilation of evidence. Approximately 6 million Jews murdered across Europe, representing 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. Additionally, the Nazis had killed approximately 5 million others: Soviet POWs, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed undesirable. The numbers were so large they exceeded comprehension. Individual tragedies multiplied millions of times created statistical horror that was simultaneously undeniable and difficult to emotionally process. Physical evidence proved crucial for establishing that the Holocaust had occurred systematically rather than as chaotic wartime violence. The tons of hair packaged for textile use. The warehouses of possessions organised by type. The architectural plans for gas chambers and crematoria. The administrative correspondence about Zyklon B deliveries. The railway documents scheduling deportation trains. The meticulous camp records listing prisoners by number. All of it demonstrated planning, organisation, and bureaucratic implementation. This was not spontaneous murder. This was engineered genocide, systematically implemented through administrative processes. This was Heydrich's legacy made visible. The liberation of camps forced the world to confront something unprecedented. Industrial genocide implemented by an advanced, educated, culturally sophisticated society using modern technology and bureaucratic organisation. The Holocaust was not ancient barbarism or primitive savagery. It was modernity applied to mass murder. Railroads, gas chambers, cremation ovens, punch card systems for tracking victims, these were tools of the 20th century repurposed for evil. And at the centre of it all, in the planning and coordination, if not the final execution, had been one man's organisational genius applied to the darkest purpose imaginable. Reinhard Heydrich had been dead for 3 years when the camps were liberated. But his machinery, built with such terrible efficiency, had continued operating until Allied armies physically dismantled it. The architect was gone. The evidence of his architecture remained. November 20th, 1945. In courtroom 600 of the Palace of Justice, in Nuremberg, Germany, the International Military Tribunal convened to prosecute major Nazi war criminals. 21 defendants sat in the dock, representing the regime's military, political, and administrative leadership. Reinhard Heydrich's name appeared repeatedly in the prosecution's opening statements, but he could not be prosecuted. He had been dead for over 3 years. Instead, the prosecutors presented organizational charts showing how Heydrich's RSHA had coordinated the Holocaust, and they called witnesses who had implemented his directives. The trial demonstrated that while Heydrich had escaped legal accountability through death, his subordinates and the systems he built could still be prosecuted. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who had succeeded Heydrich as RSHA chief in January 1943, occupied a prominent position among the defendants. The prosecution charged him with war crimes and crimes against humanity, presenting evidence that under his leadership the RSHA had continued coordinating genocide. Kaltenbrunner's defense strategy was simple. He claimed ignorance. He testified that he had merely been an administrator, unaware of extermination camps' true purposes. He blamed Heydrich for establishing the systems and policies that Kaltenbrunner had merely maintained. The judges found this defense unconvincing. Documentation proved Kaltenbrunner had received regular reports on camp operations and had signed orders for executions and deportations. On October 1st, 1946, he was sentenced to death and hanged on October 16th. December 14th, 1945. Otto Ohlendorf took the witness stand and provided testimony that shocked even prosecutors familiar with Nazi crimes. Ohlendorf, an educated economist with a doctorate, had commanded Einsatzgruppe D in southern Ukraine. He testified with bureaucratic precision that his unit had murdered approximately 90,000 people, mostly Jews, in 1 year. When asked how he could commit such acts, Ohlendorf replied that he had followed orders from Heydrich and Himmler. He showed no remorse, describing the murders in the same detached tone he might use to discuss economic statistics. His testimony revealed the mentality Heydrich had cultivated: educated men treating mass murder as administrative work requiring efficient execution. January 3rd, 1946. The prosecution introduced the Wannsee Protocol, the 15-page summary of Heydrich's January 1942 conference, coordinating the final solution. The document had been discovered in German Foreign Office files in 1947, one of 30 copies and the only survivor. Prosecutors read the protocol aloud in court, its euphemistic language transparent to listeners who understood the coded terminology. Evacuation to the east meant deportation to death camps. Special treatment meant murder. Natural diminution meant death from forced labour. The protocol proved that genocide had been coordinated at the highest levels through bureaucratic planning, not improvised by local commanders. It placed Heydrich at the centre of Holocaust coordination, even though death prevented his prosecution. April 15th, 1946. Rudolf Höss, former commandant of Auschwitz, testified for the defence in an attempt to demonstrate that concentration camp operations had been controlled by Berlin rather than by individual defendants. His testimony had the opposite effect. Höss described in clinical detail how Auschwitz had been designed and operated as an extermination facility. He explained the selection process, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the cremation of bodies, the economic exploitation of victims' possessions. He estimated that approximately 2.5 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz under his command, with an additional 500,000 dying from starvation and disease. He testified that he had received orders from Himmler but had coordinated implementation details with Heydrich's RSHA. Höss was later tried by Polish authorities, convicted, and hanged at Auschwitz in 1947. The Nuremberg verdicts delivered on October 1st, 1946 included 12 death sentences. The executions occurred on October 16th in the prison gymnasium, by hanging. But the major Nuremberg trial addressed only top leadership. Subsequent trials, the Nuremberg military tribunals, prosecuted lower-level perpetrators. The Einsatzgruppen trial, held from September 1947 to April 1948, prosecuted 24 Einsatzgruppen and Einsatzkommando commanders. The prosecution presented detailed evidence of over 1 million murders. 14 defendants received death sentences, though only 4 were actually executed. The trial established legal precedent for prosecuting systematic murder and rejected defences based on following orders. Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's specialist on Jewish affairs who had implemented deportation logistics across Europe, escaped prosecution at Nuremberg. He had fled Germany in 1945 and eventually reached Argentina using a false identity. He lived undiscovered until May 1960, when Israeli Mossad agents located and kidnapped him, transporting him to Israel for trial. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem from April to December 1961 became a global event, with testimony from over 100 Holocaust survivors. Eichmann's defence mirrored Ohlendorf's. He had merely followed orders, been a small cog in a large machine. The court rejected this defence. Eichmann had been a crucial coordinator implementing Heydrich's directives across Europe. He was convicted and hanged on June 1, 1962. The Nuremberg process established crucial legal principles: crimes against humanity as prosecutable offences, following orders as insufficient defence, and organisational guilt for criminal enterprises. The prosecution charged several Nazi organisations, including the SS and Gestapo, as criminal enterprises, meaning membership itself constituted participation in criminal activity. This organisational approach recognised that genocide required systemic participation, that thousands of individuals contributed through bureaucratic roles. Heydrich had built these organisations into instruments of mass murder. Prosecuting the organisations acknowledged that individual prosecutions could never address the breadth of participation. Yet the trials also revealed profound limitations in seeking justice for industrial genocide. Of approximately 3,000 Einsatzgruppen members who had participated in murdering over 1 million Soviet Jews, only about 1,900 faced any trial, and only 578 were convicted. Fewer than 20 were executed. Thousands of camp guards, railway personnel, civil administrators, police officials, and others who had participated in Holocaust operations were never prosecuted, either because they couldn't be identified, evidence was insufficient, or post-war authorities prioritised other concerns. The apparatus Heydrich had built involved tens of thousands of participants. Only a tiny fraction faced accountability. The question of Heydrich's own culpability remained theoretical since death had removed him from prosecution, but historical evidence established him as one of the Holocaust's principal architects. He had coordinated the Wannsee Conference that systematised the final solution. He had directed the Einsatzgruppen operations in Poland and initially in the Soviet Union. He had established the ghetto system as a holding solution. He had supervised death camp planning. He had built the bureaucratic apparatus that implemented genocide. If Nuremberg had been able to prosecute him, conviction would have been certain. But Heydrich's death demonstrated a cruel paradox. The assassination that made him a target also made him a ghost, present throughout the trials in documentation and testimony, but absent from accountability. The Nuremberg legacy was complex. The trials established that aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity were prosecutable under international law. They created precedent for holding leaders accountable for systematic atrocities. They documented the Holocaust's scale and systematization, creating an official record that would prove crucial when deniers later questioned whether the genocide occurred. But they also revealed how difficult it is to achieve justice commensurate with crimes of such magnitude. How do you punish men who murdered millions? How do you address systemic evil that required thousands of willing participants? How do you legally reckon with someone like Heydrich, whose organisational genius enabled genocide but whose death prevented prosecution? These questions remained unresolved, testament to the inadequacy of legal frameworks designed for conventional crimes when confronting industrial genocide's unprecedented scale and bureaucratic implementation. 1961. In a bulletproof glass booth in a Jerusalem courtroom, Adolf Eichmann answered questions about his role coordinating Holocaust deportations. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt sat in the gallery, observing the man who had implemented logistics for murdering millions. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she saw a bureaucrat, middle-aged, balding, speaking in clichés about duty and orders. From this observation, Arendt developed her concept of the banality of evil, the recognition that genocide could be perpetrated not by sadistic demons but by ordinary people following procedures and advancing careers. She was describing Eichmann, but she could have been describing Heydrich's entire system. The architect had discovered that evil scaled efficiently when bureaucratized. Heydrich's innovations in implementing genocide became templates replicated in subsequent mass atrocities. Cambodia in 1975 to 1979 saw Khmer Rouge implementing systematic murder of approximately 1.7 million through administrative processes. Victims were categorized by occupation and education. Intellectuals were identified through glasses or soft hands and systematically eliminated. The regime used euphemisms. Sending to study meant execution. Documentation tracked victims through crude but effective systems. The Khmer Rouge had studied Nazi methods and adapted them to Cambodian context. Heydrich's bureaucratization of genocide had created a methodology that survived him. Rwanda in 1994 demonstrated how 20th century tools could accelerate genocide. In 100 days, Hutu extremists murdered approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Radio broadcasts coordinated killings. Administrative lists identified targets by name and address. Local officials organised participation. The methodology echoed Heydrich's approach. Systematic identification of victims, coordination through existing administrative structures, use of euphemistic language, gradual escalation, normalising participation. The scale was smaller than the Holocaust and methods more primitive, but the organisational principles were recognisable. Industrial genocide's template had been established. Bosnia in 1995 brought the Srebrenica massacre, where approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically murdered in what was supposed to be a UN-protected safe area. The killings involved military coordination, transportation, logistics, communication networks, and careful documentation. Perpetrators used coded language and tried to conceal evidence. The operational planning showed influence from studying 20th century genocides, including the Holocaust. International prosecutors later recognised parallels to Heydrich's Einsatzgruppen, operations mobile killing units operating behind military lines, targeting specific populations, using systematic rather than random violence. The methods Heydrich pioneered extended beyond genocide to modern surveillance states. His card file system that tracked hundreds of thousands of Germans in the 1930s prefigured digital mass surveillance in the 21st century. The principle was identical. Collect comprehensive information on populations, cross-reference data to identify threats, use information to preempt resistance. Modern databases can track billions of individuals with efficiency Heydrich could only imagine. But the conceptual architecture originated in systems he built. The surveillance state's marriage of bureaucracy and technology began in Berlin offices where SD agents filed index cards. Heydrich's legacy also lived in language. Euphemism had been central to Holocaust implementation, special treatment for murder, resettlement for deportation to death camps. Final solution for genocide. This coded language enabled perpetrators to discuss atrocity without confronting its reality, creating psychological distance through administrative terminology. Every subsequent genocide and authoritarian regime has employed similar linguistic strategies. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Ethnic cleansing becomes population transfer. Genocide becomes security operations. The vocabulary changes, but the function remains. Using bureaucratic language to enable atrocity by obscuring its nature. Scholars developed the concept of the desk murderer to describe perpetrators like Heydrich, who coordinated mass killing from offices, never personally shooting victims, but nonetheless responsible for millions of deaths. Desk murderers make genocide bureaucratic. They optimize logistics, coordinate agencies, solve administrative problems, and meet quotas. They enable killing at scales beyond what passionate ideologues could achieve through direct action. This phenomenon, identified through studying Heydrich and his subordinates, became recognized as crucial to understanding how educated, civilized societies commit systematic atrocities. The answer wasn't that Germans were uniquely evil. The answer was that bureaucracy, properly organized, makes evil systematic, present day. Heydrich's grave location remains officially secret, somewhere in Berlin's Invalids Cemetery. The headstone was removed decades ago. No monument marks the site. German authorities fear neo-Nazi pilgrimage to honour the man they might celebrate as a martyr. This physical erasure contrasts sharply with Heydrich's conceptual persistence. Thousands of books analyse his role in the Holocaust. Universities teach courses on Nazi bureaucratic genocide using Heydrich as a case study. Military and intelligence organisations study his operational methods, stripped of moral context, as examples of effective coordination. He remains present in scholarship, education, and strategic analysis, precisely because he represents something that must be understood to be prevented. The fundamental question Heydrich's career poses is how educated, cultured individuals participate in systematic atrocity. He was a talented violinist who sent millions to death. He read philosophy and coordinated genocide. He loved his family and murdered families. This contradiction has generated enormous scholarly attention-seeking to understand the psychological mechanisms that enable such behaviour. The answers are uncomfortable. Normal human psychology, combined with ideological commitment and bureaucratic organisation, can produce participation in evil. Distance matters. Issuing orders from officers differs psychologically from shooting people. Incrementalism matters. Accepting small transgressions opens pathways to accepting larger ones. Language matters. Euphemism enables participation by avoiding confronting the reality of actions. Heydrich's story reveals that preventing genocide requires attention to systems, not just individuals. Focusing on evil leaders misses the point that genocide requires thousands of willing participants across bureaucracies. It requires transportation officials scheduling deportation trains. It requires civil servants processing identification documents. It requires factory managers supplying materials for camps. It requires accountants tracking confiscated property. It requires engineers designing gas chambers. Every participant makes genocide possible. Heydrich's genius was recognizing this and building systems that directed ordinary institutional behavior toward extraordinary evil. Preventing future genocides requires building institutional resistance into bureaucracies themselves, creating systems that cannot be so easily repurposed for atrocity. The final lesson of Heydrich's career is that modernity's tools are morally neutral. Technology, bureaucracy, rationality, efficiency all can serve either humane, inhuman purposes. The same organisational principles that enable effective government can enable systematic murder. The same transportation networks that move people to opportunities can move them to death. The same record-keeping that protects citizens' rights can target them for destruction. Heydrich took modernity's tools and weaponized them for genocide. His legacy is the recognition that civilization and barbarism are not opposites but can be combined, that the Holocaust was not a departure from modernity but a possibility within it. This uncomfortable truth requires constant vigilance. The systems that make modern life possible require conscious effort to prevent their abuse. Heydrich's shadow falls across the 21st century not because we honour him but because we must remember him. Understanding that the capacity for systematic evil he demonstrated remains latent in our own bureaucracies, technologies, and institutions, waiting for ideology and opportunity to activate it. The architect is dead, the blueprints survive. Only constant attention prevents their reuse.